Imagine you encounter a statement that reads as follows: if this sentence is true, then Santa Claus exists. Now, consider the logical structure of this self-referential claim carefully, for it presents a peculiar challenge to our understanding of how language and truth interact. The paradox was first formally articulated by the logician Haskell Curry in 1931, though the underlying mechanism had troubled philosophers for centuries before that fateful year. At its heart lies a deceptively simple mechanism that demonstrates how our ordinary reasoning processes can lead us into logical quicksand without any obvious warning signs or contradictions along the way. If we assume the sentence is true, then by its own claim, we must accept that if it is true, then Santa Claus exists, which means Santa Claus must exist. But if we assume the sentence is false, then the conditional statement it makes becomes vacuously true, since false antecedents make conditionals true, and therefore the sentence itself becomes true, which contradicts our assumption. This creates a tangled loop where truth and falsity seem to chase each other endlessly. What makes Curry's paradox particularly insidious compared to other self-referential problems is that it does not require us to posit any obvious logical contradiction or violation of the law of non-contradiction, as classical liars' paradoxes do. Instead, it exploits the innocuous-seeming conditional statement, the simple, if-then structure that undergirds so much of our reasoning about causes, relationships, and logical consequences. The paradox persists in our philosophical landscape precisely because it highlights a deep tension in how we understand the nature of truth and meaning in language, suggesting that perhaps our classical logical systems are incomplete or that self-reference in language poses challenges we have not adequately resolved. We have largely normalized this paradox through increasingly sophisticated logical frameworks, from relevant logic to paraconsistent systems, each attempting to avoid the trap, yet the fundamental question remains suspended above us like a hanging question mark. Perhaps the most troubling insight Curry's paradox offers is that we need not restrict it to absurd conclusions like Santa's existence. We can substitute any arbitrary proposition, from mathematical falsehoods to metaphysical claims, revealing that the paradox is not merely a curiosity about a single statement, but rather a systematic vulnerability in how conditional reasoning itself interacts with self-reference and truth. This structural fragility suggests that any formal system permitting both self-reference and classical conditionals must carefully circumscribe how truth predicates operate, lest we inadvertently create pathways by which arbitrary falsehoods can be derived as logical consequences. In this sense, Curry's paradox functions as a cautionary tale about the limits of formal systems themselves, reminding us that logical coherence sometimes demands we make uncomfortable choices about which features of ordinary language we are willing to sacrifice. One such choice involves restricting the strength of our truth predicates or abandoning the principle that all well-formed sentences must be either true or false, moves that feel philosophically costly even when logically necessary. Consider a peculiar scenario proposed by philosopher Stephen Yablo in 1993, wherein we imagine an infinite sequence of sentences, each one making a claim about all the sentences that come after it in the list. The first sentence declares that all subsequent sentences, from the second onward, are false. The second sentence then claims that all sentences following it, from the third onward, are false. The third sentence makes an identical assertion about all sentences that follow it, and this pattern continues infinitely into the distance. Now, when we attempt to evaluate whether any individual sentence in this sequence is true or false, we immediately encounter a profound logical difficulty that mirrors the famous liar's paradox, yet possesses a distinctly different character. If we suppose that the first sentence is true, then all the sentences that follow it must indeed be false, which means the second sentence is false, which then means that not all sentences following the second are false, creating an immediate contradiction. Conversely, if the first sentence is false, then at least one sentence in the infinite chain following it must be true, but we cannot identify which one, because if any sentence were true, it would claim that all its successors are false, which would require all of them to be false, yet we started by assuming at least one must be true. The mechanism at work here involves a kind of infinite regress of evaluation, where our attempts to assign truth values to any sentence in the sequence perpetually shift the burden of evaluation to another sentence further down the line, never reaching a fixed point of resolution. What makes Yablo's paradox particularly fascinating is that it appears to achieve self-reference without actually being self-referential in the traditional sense. Each sentence only refers to sentences that come after it, never to itself, yet the infinite structure creates a logical entanglement just as troubling as any direct circular reference. Despite its abstract nature and the intellectual clarity with which we can state its structure, this paradox continues to resist resolution, and philosophers remain genuinely uncertain whether it reveals something fundamental about the nature of language, logic, and truth itself, or whether some subtle distinction we have not yet fully grasped might dissolve its apparent contradiction entirely. Some philosophers have proposed that the paradox might be resolved by rejecting the principle of bivalence, the assumption that every statement must be either true or false, or by reconsidering what it means for an infinite chain of statements to possess determinate truth values at all. Others suggest that Yablo's paradox ultimately demonstrates the limitations of formal logic when confronted with infinite self-referential structures, pushing us toward new frameworks for understanding truth that can accommodate the strange behaviors of such boundary cases. In this sense, Yablo's paradox serves as a conceptual bridge between classical logic and contemporary work in non-classical logics, where researchers explore paraconsistent systems that tolerate contradiction or constructivist approaches that deny the law of excluded middle altogether. The paradox thus remains not merely a puzzle to be solved, but a productive challenge that continues to reshape how philosophers and logicians think about infinity, truth, and the fundamental structures underlying rational discourse. Imagine you are sitting in a library, surrounded by dictionaries and reference books, and you begin to contemplate the nature of words themselves, specifically whether words can describe their own properties in a self-referential manner. The Grelling-Nelson paradox emerges from this simple curiosity, asking us to consider a distinction between two categories of words: those that are autological, meaning they describe themselves, and those that are heterological, meaning they do not describe themselves. For instance, the word short is autological because the word itself is indeed short in length, while the word long is heterological because the word itself is not particularly long despite describing something that is. This seems straightforward enough until you begin to examine the word heterological itself, which creates a logical trap from which there is no escape. If the word heterological truly describes itself accurately, then it must itself be heterological, meaning it should not describe itself, which creates a contradiction. However, if heterological does not describe itself, then it fails to be heterological, which also creates a contradiction. The mechanism behind this paradox lies in the way language can fold back upon itself, creating self-reference loops that break the normal rules of logic and categorization that we depend on to make sense of the world around us. The paradox exploits the peculiar property that language possesses, which is its ability to talk about itself while simultaneously being the very thing it discusses. Most people navigate through their daily lives without ever encountering this problem, because we typically use words to refer to external objects and concepts, rather than examining the words themselves as objects worthy of philosophical scrutiny. Yet the paradox persists in the background of linguistic philosophy, a quiet reminder that even the most fundamental tools of human communication contain hidden contradictions, and that the very system we use to describe reality might harbor inconsistencies that we have simply grown accustomed to overlooking or ignoring altogether. This recognition has profound implications for mathematicians and logicians, who must carefully construct formal systems with explicit rules about self-reference to avoid similar paradoxes lurking within their foundations, suggesting that some of the deepest puzzles about truth and language may ultimately be unavoidable features of any sufficiently complex system of communication. In essence, the Grelling-Nelson paradox reveals that language operates not as a transparent window onto reality, but rather as a mirror that can turn inward upon itself. And this capacity for self-reflection, while enabling abstract thought and philosophical inquiry, simultaneously introduces the very contradictions that make absolute logical certainty impossible in any system complex enough to contain its own descriptions. Perhaps this is why mathematicians have learned to distinguish between object language and metalanguage, creating separate levels of discourse to prevent words from collapsing into self-referential chaos. Yet even this solution merely pushes the paradox to a higher level rather than truly resolving it. The Grelling-Nelson paradox thus stands as a monument to the limits of formal systems themselves. Consider a librarian tasked with cataloging the smallest possible numbers that cannot be described using fewer than 20 English words, and imagine that this librarian attempts to create a comprehensive list of all such numbers, working methodically through the natural numbers and marking each one that requires 20 or more words to define uniquely. The librarian might write down that the number 87,432 cannot be described in 19 words or fewer, and then continues this process, documenting each indescribable number with great care and precision. Now imagine that this librarian, having completed substantial research, decides to create a shorthand reference and begins using the phrase, the smallest number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 English words, as a convenient label for the first number on their list. Here emerges the fundamental contradiction at the heart of what we call the Berry paradox, a logical puzzle that haunts the boundary between language and mathematics. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through the tension between definability and description length itself, for the phrase just mentioned contains only 18 words, meaning that the number it purports to identify has actually been described in fewer than 20 words, which contradicts the very definition of that number. This creates a strange loop where the attempt to identify something indefinable becomes itself a definition that is too concise to apply to what it describes. The paradox persists in our thinking because we naturally assume that all numbers can be meaningfully discussed and identified through language, and we further assume that the length of a description is independent of what that description refers to. We have normalized the paradoxical nature of this puzzle by accepting it as merely a linguistic curiosity, rather than recognizing it as a fundamental challenge to how language relates to mathematical reality, allowing it to remain suspended in a state of philosophical ambiguity that neither fully resolves nor entirely destabilizes our everyday use of language to discuss abstract concepts. Yet perhaps this irresolution serves a purpose, for it forces us to confront the limits of treating language as a transparent window onto mathematical truth, and to recognize that some boundaries between the sayable and the unsayable cannot be crossed without collapsing the very distinction we attempted to draw. In this way, the Berry paradox reveals that our confidence in language's ability to carve nature at its joints may itself be misplaced, not because language fails us, but because we have asked it to do something it was never designed to do, establish absolute boundaries where only relative distinctions exist. The paradox thus becomes not a flaw in our reasoning, but rather a mirror reflecting back the hidden assumptions we bring to every act of definition and description. When we attempt to categorize numbers by their definitional complexity, we discover that the very act of categorization creates new definitions that undermine our taxonomies, a lesson that extends far beyond mathematics into any domain where we try to establish hierarchies of complexity or accessibility. This suggests that paradoxes like Berry's are not errors to be eliminated through more careful reasoning, but rather permanent features of self-referential systems where language turns its analytical gaze upon itself. Imagine a mathematician sitting at a desk, tasked with defining all the numbers that can be described using only a finite number of English words. And as she works through this seemingly straightforward exercise, she begins to notice something deeply unsettling about the very nature of language and mathematics and how they interact with one another. Richard's paradox emerges when we consider the set of all real numbers that can be precisely defined in English using no more than, say, 1,000 words, and when we count how many such numbers exist, we discover there are only finitely many definitions available, since there are only finitely many ways to arrange English words up to that length. Yet there are infinitely many real numbers between 0 and 1. Which means there must exist some real numbers that cannot be defined in English with any finite number of words. This observation leads to the genuine paradox when we attempt to define a specific number by saying it is the smallest real number that cannot be defined in English using fewer than 1,000 words, because in doing so, we have just defined it using only about 20 words, which directly contradicts our definition that it cannot be defined using fewer than 1,000 words. The mechanism that makes this paradox so intellectually troubling operates at the intersection of formal mathematics and natural language, where we discover that the property of being definable seems to depend entirely on which language system we are using, yet we treat mathematical reality as though it exists independently of any language at all. The paradox reveals a fundamental tension in how we believe mathematics relates to language, suggesting that either mathematical objects are somehow dependent on our ability to describe them using words, or that the concept of definability itself is not as clear and unambiguous as we normally assume it to be. We navigate this paradox in our everyday mathematical work by simply accepting that some objects may be real and meaningful, yet ultimately impossible to specify or describe with precision. And this acceptance has become so normalized that we rarely acknowledge the strange philosophical compromise we are making when we work with infinite sets or irrational numbers that we can never fully express in words. Yet perhaps this paradox points towards something more profound, that the gap between what exists and what we can say about it may be not a flaw in our thinking, but rather an essential feature of any formal system attempting to describe a reality richer than itself, much as Gödel's incompleteness theorems would later show that no consistent mathematical system can prove all truths about itself. In this sense, Richard's paradox serves as an early warning sign that mathematics and language are not simply tools we can use transparently to capture an independent reality, but rather they are themselves part of the very structure through which reality becomes knowable to us, a recognition that would reshape how mathematicians and logicians approach the foundations of their discipline throughout the 20th century. The recognition that language itself constrains what we can know mathematically opened pathways toward formal logic and symbolic systems designed to sidestep natural language's inherent ambiguities. Yet paradoxically, these very systems would eventually encounter their own versions of the same fundamental limits that Richard's paradox had exposed. Imagine a vast collection of numbered balls, an infinite series beginning with ball number 1 and continuing endlessly into mathematical abstraction. Now picture a procedure that unfolds across infinite time. During the first minute, you place balls numbered 1 through 10 into an empty urn, then remove ball number 1, leaving 9 balls inside. During the second minute, you add balls 11 through 20 into the urn and remove ball number 2, leaving 18 balls inside. This process continues indefinitely, with each successive minute following the same pattern of adding 10 new balls and removing a single ball according to a systematic numbering scheme. After infinite time has passed, after all these operations have been completed across the endless progression of moments, you open the urn to examine its contents. Despite having added infinitely many balls throughout this entire process, the urn is completely empty. Not a single ball remains, though you have performed far more additions than removals, creating an outcome that seems to violate our most basic intuitions about accumulation and mathematical balance. The paradox emerges from the peculiar behavior of infinity itself when we attempt to apply finite reasoning to infinite processes. Each individual ball, when we trace its journey through the procedure, is eventually removed according to the predetermined removal schedule. Ball 1 is removed at step 1, ball 2 at step 2, and ball number n is removed at step n, meaning that no matter which ball we examine, we can identify the precise moment when it left the urn. Yet simultaneously, at every finite stage of the process, the urn contains an increasing number of balls, growing from 9 to 18 to 27 and beyond. This creates a profound disconnect between what happens at every finite moment and what emerges at infinity. What makes this paradox so conceptually unsettling is how it reveals the inadequacy of human intuition when confronting infinite quantities and processes. We habitually reason about accumulation and loss based on finite experience, where adding more items than you remove will always result in a net gain. We have internalized this principle so thoroughly that it feels like a fundamental truth about reality itself. Yet the Ross-Littlewood paradox demonstrates that infinity operates according to different rules, that our everyday logic breaks down when extended beyond its proper domain. We continue to trust our intuitions about infinity despite repeatedly encountering scenarios where they lead us astray, because acknowledging the limits of our reasoning feels deeply uncomfortable, and because these infinite situations rarely emerge in practical circumstances where we must make decisions or predictions. The paradox also illuminates why mathematics requires us to abandon intuition in favor of rigorous formal definitions. Infinity is not simply a really big number, but a fundamentally different category of being that demands its own rules and logic, rules that can seem absurd only because we are creatures of the finite world trying to peer across a boundary we cannot truly inhabit. The same principle explains why we cannot simply count the remaining balls at infinity as we might at any finite stage. The very act of reaching infinity transforms the problem in ways that finite counting cannot capture. Imagine a lamp that switches on and off according to a very particular sequence of events, beginning with the lamp in the off position at time 0, then switching on at half a minute, then off at 1/4 minute before that, then on at 1/8 of a minute before that, and continuing infinitely backwards through time, with each interval becoming progressively smaller and smaller, approaching but never quite reaching the initial moment of 0. This thought experiment, conceived by British philosopher James F. Thomson in 1954, presents us with a peculiar logical puzzle about infinite sequences and their endpoints, asking us to consider what state the lamp would actually be in once all of these infinite operations had somehow been completed. The paradox emerges when we attempt to determine whether, after an infinite number of switches occurring in a finite span of time, the lamp would ultimately be illuminated or dark, and we find ourselves unable to provide a coherent answer despite the logical impossibility of any intermediate state. The mechanism underlying this puzzle exploits our intuitions about physical processes and their natural conclusions, for we are accustomed to thinking that any sequence of events, no matter how rapidly occurring, must eventually culminate in some final state that we can identify and describe with certainty. Yet Thomson's lamp demonstrates that infinity operates according to different rules than the finite processes we observe in everyday experience, and that we cannot simply assume that completing an infinite number of actions is equivalent to finishing a regular task that merely takes a very long time. What makes this paradox so persistently compelling despite its abstract nature is that it reveals a genuine tension between our mathematical understanding of infinite sequences, which can be perfectly rigorous and well-defined, and our physical intuitions about causation and state, which seem to demand that things must be somewhere and in some condition after a process concludes. We have grown comfortable with certain infinities in mathematics, treating them as legitimate objects of study, yet when we attempt to apply these infinite concepts to physical systems like lamps, we encounter resistance from our intuitions about how reality must actually work. This disconnect suggests that infinite processes may not be physically realizable at all, or that our classical logic simply breaks down when confronted with truly infinite scenarios, leaving us to wonder whether Thomson's lamp ultimately reveals a flaw in mathematics, physics, or merely the limits of our conceptual frameworks. Some philosophers have argued that the paradox simply demonstrates the impossibility of Thomson's lamp as a physical device, suggesting that the real lesson is not about mathematics or logic failing, but about the constraints of the physical world itself, that certain infinities, while mathematically coherent, cannot be instantiated in reality because they would require an impossible physical mechanism. Others contend that the lamp's indeterminate final state actually points toward a need for entirely new logical systems that can accommodate infinities more naturally than classical logic allows, hinting that our binary categories of on and off may be too rigid to capture what genuinely happens at the boundary between infinite and finite time. Imagine a man named Tristram Shandy who decides to write his autobiography with meticulous detail, determined to record every single event of his life with perfect accuracy and completeness. He begins his narrative by describing the circumstances of his conception, then moves forward through his birth, his christening, and the various peculiar incidents of his early childhood, dwelling on each moment with such elaborate attention that it takes him an entire year of writing just to document the first day of his life. As he continues this exhausting project, a troubling realization emerges. At the rate he is writing, he will never be able to catch up with the present moment, for the time required to describe his experiences will always exceed the time available to him before new experiences occur and demand equal documentation. The project becomes mathematically impossible, a race against time that he can never win, as each moment lived creates new material that must be recorded, pushing the completion of his autobiography further and further into an unreachable future. Yet here emerges the profound logical paradox at the heart of this scenario. If we consider the infinite case where Tristram Shandy were to live forever, writing at a constant rate, then by the mathematical properties of infinity, he would eventually describe every moment of his life in perfect detail, completing an autobiography that covers his entire infinite existence. In other words, infinity provides just enough time to catalog infinity itself, a counterintuitive truth that seems to resolve the initial impossibility while simultaneously deepening the conceptual confusion. The paradox reveals how our intuitions about time, completion, and the relationship between life and its documentation fundamentally mislead us. We continue living and recording our lives despite understanding that perfect documentation is impossible, finding meaning in the incomplete chronicles we create, accepting that memory and narrative will always remain fragmentary and selective approximations of lived experience. This limitation mirrors the human condition itself. We are all writing our autobiographies in real time, perpetually behind, yet somehow creating meaningful narratives from the fragments we manage to capture before they dissolve into the past. Perhaps this is why Lawrence Stern's original novel itself becomes a playful enactment of this paradox. The more elaborate digressions the narrator includes, the further he falls behind in his chronology, yet the richer and more textured his life becomes through the very act of failing to capture it completely. In this way, the incompleteness is not a flaw, but the source of literature's deepest truth. The paradox thus teaches us that life's meaning emerges not from exhaustive documentation, but from the selective emphasis we place on certain moments. The digressions become the destination. We live not to complete a record, but to discover what matters most through the very act of deciding what is worth telling. Just as Tristram Shandy's endless digressions about his Uncle Toby's hobby horse or his father's theories ultimately matter more than chronological fact, we too find that our lives are defined not by the events themselves, but by how we choose to narrate them, transforming the paradox of incompleteness into an opportunity for meaning-making that transcends mere documentation. Imagine you are sitting in a quiet pub on an ordinary evening, observing the various patrons scattered throughout the establishment, each engaged in their own pursuits and conversations, when suddenly a curious logical puzzle presents itself to your contemplative mind. The drinker paradox, also known as the drinker's theorem, proposes a deceptively simple yet profoundly unsettling statement. There exists at least one person in this pub such that if that person is drinking, then everyone in the pub is drinking. At first hearing, this seems absurd, almost laughable in its apparent impossibility, yet the logical structure beneath it is absolutely airtight and mathematically irrefutable. The paradox operates on the principle of logical necessity rather than causal relationship, a distinction that confuses our ordinary intuitions about how the world works. Consider that either everyone in the pub is drinking, or at least one person is not drinking, these being the only two exhaustive possibilities available to us. If everyone is already drinking, then the statement is trivially satisfied, because you can point to any person whatsoever and correctly assert that if they are drinking, then everyone is drinking, since everyone is already engaged in that activity. However, if at least one person is not drinking, then you can point to that very person and make your paradoxical claim, for if a non-drinker were drinking, which they are not, then by the rules of logical implication, any statement following from an impossible premise becomes vacuously true. The deeper mechanism at work involves our conflation of logical implication with causal influence, as our minds instinctively expect that if one person's drinking somehow causes everyone else to drink, yet the paradox makes no such causal claim whatsoever. Instead, it merely asserts a logical relationship that must hold true in at least one case through pure mathematical necessity, regardless of the actual circumstances or social dynamics present in the room. What makes this paradox so persistent in philosophical discourse is precisely this gap between logical truth and intuitive expectation, the way our brains reflexively seek causal explanations where none exist, transforming an abstract mathematical principle into something that feels practically meaningful. Yet this very confusion reveals something profound about human cognition itself. We are creatures hardwired to search for meaning and causation even in the austere landscape of pure logic, and the drinker paradox exploits this fundamental quirk of our nature, forcing us to confront the sometimes uncomfortable truth that mathematical certainty and practical sense need not always align. In fact, the drinker paradox belongs to a family of similar logical puzzles that reveal the strange power of existential quantification, the ability to assert that something must be true somewhere, even when we cannot identify where. And this same principle underlies many seemingly paradoxical theorems in mathematics and philosophy that challenge our intuitive grasp of infinity, probability, and necessity itself. Consider how this same logical structure appears in other domains. There must exist a point on Earth where the temperature is exactly average for that latitude, or a moment when your heart rate precisely matches the global mean, purely by the inexorable logic of continuity rather than any coordinating force orchestrating such alignment. Imagine a foot race between the legendary Greek warrior Achilles, known for his extraordinary speed and athletic prowess, and a common tortoise, the slowest of creatures, moving with deliberate and measured steps across the ground. Before the race begins, the tortoise is given a substantial head start, perhaps 100 meters or more, creating an initial distance that separates the two competitors at the moment the race officially commences. Now picture Achilles accelerating with all his might, his legs propelling him forward with tremendous velocity, yet as he reaches the point where the tortoise began, he discovers that the creature has moved forward during the time it took him to cover that distance. When Achilles sprints to this new position, the tortoise has again advanced, having traveled some additional distance, no matter how brief the interval might be. This process repeats infinitely, with Achilles perpetually reaching the place where the tortoise was, only to find that the tortoise has moved ahead once more, suggesting that Achilles can never actually overtake his slow-moving opponent despite his overwhelming speed advantage. The paradox functions through a particular kind of logical trap involving infinite divisibility and the nature of motion itself. When we break down the chase into infinitely many smaller segments, each one requiring Achilles to catch up to where the tortoise has already moved, we create a mathematical sequence that appears to require infinite steps to complete, which our minds struggle to reconcile with the finite time we know such a race would actually take in reality. The mechanism operates by fragmenting continuous motion into discrete pieces and then suggesting that because there are infinite pieces, the motion cannot be accomplished, even though mathematics demonstrates that infinite sequences can indeed sum to finite values. What makes this paradox persist in human consciousness is our intuitive discomfort with infinity and our difficulty visualizing how something infinite can be contained within something finite, a conceptual framework that contradicts our everyday experience of the world where tasks have clear endpoints and completion is always achievable in measurable time. Yet when we apply the mathematical tools of calculus and limits, the paradox dissolves entirely. The infinite series of distances Achilles must traverse converges to a finite sum, allowing him to overtake the tortoise in a perfectly ordinary amount of time, revealing that Zeno's paradox ultimately demonstrates not the impossibility of motion, but rather the limitations of our intuitive reasoning when confronted with the counterintuitive nature of infinity. This resolution points to a deeper truth. The paradox reveals not a flaw in reality, but rather the necessity of developing sophisticated mathematical frameworks to understand phenomena that outpace our immediate intuition, reminding us that reason and rigorous analysis are essential tools for penetrating beyond the surface appearance of the world to grasp its underlying logical structure. In this way, Zeno's paradox serves as a historical turning point in human intellectual development, marking the moment when ancient philosophy confronted the limits of pure logic and ultimately gave rise to the mathematical innovations that would culminate in calculus centuries later, demonstrating how confronting seemingly insurmountable conceptual problems can catalyze the creation of entire. Imagine an archer drawing back a bowstring, the wooden shaft nocked and ready, the moment before release suspended in perfect stillness. In that instant, the arrow occupies a specific location in space, and if we examine any single moment during its flight through the air toward a distant target, we find ourselves confronted with a peculiar problem that has troubled philosophers since ancient Greece. At any given instant of time, the arrow exists at a particular point in space, occupying a space equal to its own length, and if something occupies a space equal to its own dimensions, then at that moment it is stationary, not in motion. Yet we know the arrow travels from the bow to the target, covering distance and time, so how can something that is motionless at every instant of time appear to move across space? This is the essence of Zeno's arrow paradox, formulated by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea around 2,500 years ago as a challenge to the possibility of motion itself. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests upon a fundamental confusion about the nature of time and motion, a conceptual entanglement that arises from treating instantaneous position as if it were equivalent to the state of rest. When we freeze a single moment in time, we are examining a snapshot, a static frame like those in a motion picture film, and in that frozen frame there is indeed no motion visible, only position. However, motion itself is not a property that exists within a single instant. Rather, it is a property that exists across multiple instants, across intervals of time. The arrow possesses velocity, which is defined as change in position over change in time, and this definition requires at least two different moments to be meaningful. At a single instant, divorced from temporal context, velocity has no meaning and motion cannot be demonstrated, yet this does not prevent the arrow from traveling. We have largely normalized and moved beyond this paradox through the development of calculus and modern physics, frameworks that allow us to describe instantaneous velocity and acceleration through mathematical derivatives and limits, yet something about the paradox persists in human intuition and perception. Even though we understand intellectually that motion occurs across time intervals and not within them, there remains a subtle discomfort in the way the paradox forces us to confront the gap between our experience of continuous motion and the mathematical abstraction of instantaneous states, a gap that mirrors deeper questions about the nature of time itself and whether reality is fundamentally continuous or discrete. Perhaps this is why the paradox haunts us still. It reveals that our deepest intuitions about motion and time may rest on foundations we do not fully understand, and that the arrow's flight, though explained by mathematics, remains in some sense a mystery about the very texture of existence itself. When we watch an arrow in flight, we witness something our minds accept without question, yet our reason struggles to fully explain. A reminder that understanding the world sometimes requires using not just logic, but also accepting that certain phenomena may exceed the precision of any single framework we devise to contain them. The paradox reminds us that even in an age of unprecedented scientific precision, ancient questions about motion and time retain their philosophical power, challenging each generation to examine the assumption. Imagine a man from the island of Crete who stands before you and makes a single declaration: all Cretans are liars. This simple statement, attributed to the ancient philosopher Epimenides, creates an impossible logical knot that has perplexed thinkers for thousands of years, and as you contemplate its nature, you may find your mind drifting into the hazy space between truth and falsehood, where certainty dissolves. The paradox emerges when we examine what happens if we accept his statement as true. For if it is true that all Cretans are liars, then Epimenides himself, being a Cretan, must be a liar, which means his statement is false. And yet if his statement is false, then not all Cretans are liars, which would make his statement true again, trapping us in an endless cycle of logical reversal where truth becomes falsehood and falsehood becomes truth in an infinite loop. The mechanism that generates this paradoxical situation rests fundamentally upon self-reference, upon the unique capability of language to fold back upon itself and create statements that describe their own nature. And this self-referential quality creates a situation where the very act of evaluating the statement's truth value changes its truth value in ways that prevent us from ever reaching a stable conclusion or resolution. What makes this paradox so psychologically compelling is that it reveals the limitations of formal logic when confronted with statements that reference themselves, exposing the assumption that every statement must be either true or false, and that these categories are mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Yet self-referential paradoxes suggest that some statements may exist in a space beyond this binary framework, occupying a realm where standard logical rules lose their purchase and our usual methods of determining truth no longer apply. Despite philosophers and logicians developing increasingly sophisticated approaches to eliminate or contain this paradox, from denying self-reference to creating hierarchical levels of language to inventing multivalued logical systems, the paradox persists in human consciousness as a reminder that language and logic are tools created by imperfect minds to comprehend a reality that sometimes exceeds their grasp. And we have normalized this paradox by acknowledging that certain self-referential statements simply exist outside the bounds of classical logic rather than representing true failures of reason. Yet the paradox still calls to something deep within us, suggesting that the foundations upon which we build our understanding of truth itself may contain irreducible contradictions that we must simply accept and live with. And perhaps this acceptance itself is the paradox's deepest lesson, that the pursuit of perfect logical consistency may be less important than our ability to navigate ambiguity and live productively within the spaces where language reaches its limits, recognizing that even our most rigorous systems of thought must ultimately rest upon foundations that cannot be proven from within themselves. The Cretan lyre thus becomes not a failure of reason, but a mirror held up to reason itself, reflecting back the beautiful imperfection of how we actually think and communicate, reminding us that meaning-making is less about achieving perfect logical purity and more about constructing shared understanding within the inherent ambiguities of human language. Consider a librarian tasked with cataloging all the books in an enormous library, and suppose this librarian decides to create a special master catalog that lists every single book in the collection, but with one unusual rule. This master catalog will only include books that do not list themselves as one of their own contents, that is, books that are not self-referential in their indexing. The librarian works diligently through thousands of volumes, carefully noting which books belong in this special catalog and which ones do not, until one day a troubling question emerges. Should the master catalog itself be listed within the master catalog? If the catalog does list itself, then by definition it should not be included, because the catalog only contains books that do not list themselves. But if the catalog does not list itself, then it must be included, because it is precisely the kind of book that does not list itself, and the catalog is meant to contain all such books. We find ourselves trapped in a perfect logical loop with no escape, a contradiction that seems to arise not from confusion or carelessness, but from the very foundations of how we organize information and create categories. This paradox, articulated by the mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century, reveals something profound about the nature of self-reference and the limits of formal systems. The mechanism at work is deceptively simple. When we create a set or category defined by a certain property, we implicitly allow that set to potentially possess the very property we used to define it, and this recursive quality creates an impossible situation where the definition consumes itself. Russell's paradox emerged during a period when mathematicians were constructing increasingly sophisticated systems of logic and set theory, believing they had found a universal language for describing all mathematical truths. Yet this single paradox demonstrated that the foundation itself contained hidden fractures. The problem is not that we made an error in reasoning or overlooked some detail. Rather, the paradox reveals that certain intuitive ways of forming sets and categories lead inevitably to contradiction when we allow unrestricted self-reference. What makes Russell's paradox particularly unsettling is that we have largely moved past it without fully resolving the underlying tension, instead working around it by imposing restrictions on how sets can be formed and which objects can belong to which categories. We have learned to avoid creating sets that contain themselves or that have ambiguous self-referential properties, and mathematicians now work within carefully bounded systems where such contradictions cannot emerge. Yet the paradox persists in philosophy and logic as a reminder that our systems of organization and categorization rest upon conventions and limitations rather than absolute truths, and despite the best efforts of formal mathematics and symbolic logic to create perfect frameworks, the ghost of self-reference continues to haunt the boundaries of what can be rigorously defined and categorized. In this sense, Russell's paradox serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that every meaningful description automatically defines a valid set, teaching us that the power to name and categorize comes with built-in limitations that we cannot simply think our way around. Consider the question that has puzzled theologians and philosophers for centuries. Can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy that even they cannot lift it? This deceptively simple inquiry opens into one of the most profound logical contradictions we can contemplate, touching upon the very nature of power, existence, and the limits of logical possibility itself. The paradox presents us with a seemingly inescapable dilemma where any answer we provide appears to undermine the very definition of omnipotence that we began with, forcing us into a corner where absolute power suddenly becomes logically impossible. When we imagine an all-powerful entity, we typically conceptualize unlimited ability to create, transform, and control reality according to their will. Yet the moment we introduce this specific test case, the foundation crumbles beneath our understanding like sand in the tide. If the omnipotent being can create such a stone, then they encounter something they cannot lift, which contradicts their omnipotence. But if they cannot create such a stone, then there exists something their power cannot accomplish, which equally contradicts omnipotence. The mechanism underlying this paradox reveals something profound about the nature of logical possibility itself. Omnipotence, when defined as the ability to do anything whatsoever, contains within it a hidden logical impossibility that cannot be resolved through any rational framework. We have come to understand that true omnipotence, if such a thing could meaningfully exist, must be omnipotence constrained by logical consistency, meaning an omnipotent being could not perform logically contradictory acts any more than they could make 2 plus 2 equal 5. Yet despite our modern philosophical sophistication and our accumulated understanding of these logical boundaries, the paradox persists in human consciousness not as a solved puzzle, but as an enduring reminder that the very concept of unlimited power contains paradox at its foundation, and that perhaps the most profound form of power involves accepting the logical limits that even unlimited ability must respect. This recognition that true power exists within logical boundaries rather than outside them reframes our understanding of omnipotence itself. Perhaps an omnipotent being's greatest strength lies not in defying logic, but in the perfect comprehension and mastery of all that logic permits, making the paradox less a limitation and more a revelation of what genuine, coherent power actually means. In this light, we might reconsider whether the question itself reveals more about the structure of reality than about any supposed limitation of divine power. For a being that can accomplish all logically possible things has, in fact, lost nothing of true omnipotence, only the incoherent desire to transcend the very rules that make accomplishment meaningful. The paradox thus teaches us that coherence itself is the ultimate framework within which power operates. Just as a master musician cannot create beauty by playing random noise, an omnipotent being cannot transcend the logical structures that give meaning to creation itself. In recognizing this, we transform the paradox from a logical trap into a philosophical insight, that the deepest form of power is the power to create within constraints, not despite them. Imagine a scenario in which a famous composer from the 21st century travels backward through time with a completed symphony, and upon arriving in the 18th century, he gives this masterpiece to a younger version of a historical composer who then spends years refining it, publishing it under his own name, and becoming world-renowned for this very work. The time traveler from the future had obtained the symphony from history books and recordings that credited the historical composer as its original creator, yet the historical composer only created it because he received it from the time traveler who got it from those same historical records. The question that emerges from this circular causality is deceptively simple. Where did the symphony actually originate? No one created it in the traditional sense where information flows forward through time in a linear progression. Instead, the symphony exists in a perfect loop, each iteration an exact copy of the previous one, with information appearing to generate itself across time without ever being composed by anyone at any specific moment. This is the essence of what physicists and philosophers call the Bootstrap paradox, a thought experiment that challenges our fundamental understanding of causation, creation, and the direction of time itself. The paradox works by exploiting the logical implications of time travel, specifically the possibility of closed time-like curves where cause and effect collapse into a self-sustaining loop. When we examine how such paradoxes persist in our thinking despite their apparent logical impossibility, we notice that they reveal something profound about the nature of information and creation. We typically assume that all information must originate somewhere, that something cannot come from nothing, and that causes must precede effects in time. Yet the Bootstrap paradox suggests that if time travel were possible, these deeply held intuitions about how reality works would need revision. Some physicists propose that the Novikov self-consistency principle prevents such paradoxes by constraining events so that contradictions cannot occur, while others suggest that the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics allows branching timelines where the paradox resolves itself. Regardless of the proposed solution, the Bootstrap paradox remains intellectually unsettling because it exposes the boundaries of our causal reasoning and demonstrates how our intuitions about time, creation, and causality might be incomplete or even fundamentally mistaken in ways we have not yet discovered. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is that the Bootstrap paradox may not be merely theoretical. If information can exist in a closed loop without origin, it raises the question of whether certain fundamental constants, laws of physics, or even the universe itself might be self-bootstrapping phenomena that require no external creator or initial cause. This possibility transforms the Bootstrap paradox from a mere curiosity about time travel into a profound meditation on existence itself, suggesting that the ultimate origin of reality might not be a question with an answer, but rather a logical impossibility that we must learn to accept as the fundamental nature of what is. In this light, the Bootstrap paradox becomes less a problem to solve and more a mirror reflecting back the limits of human comprehension, inviting us to consider whether some mysteries are woven into the fabric of existence. Imagine two identical twins born on Earth at the same moment in time, sharing the same genetic material and the same initial experience of the world around them. One twin remains on our planet, living out a conventional life marked by the ordinary passage of days and years, while the other twin boards a spacecraft traveling at nearly the speed of light, journeys through the cosmos for what feels like 5 years from their perspective, and then returns to Earth. According to Einstein's theory of special relativity, time moves at different rates depending on the speed at which an object is traveling through space, a phenomenon known as time dilation. The traveling twin, moving at such tremendous velocity relative to Earth, experiences time more slowly than their stationary sibling, meaning that while 5 years pass for the space-traveling twin, perhaps 50 years or more have elapsed on Earth. When the traveling twin returns home, they discover that their Earth-bound sibling has aged dramatically, while they themselves have barely aged at all, creating a profound asymmetry between two individuals who began their lives in perfect synchronization. The paradox emerges from the apparent contradiction within Einstein's principle of relativity, which suggests that motion is only relative and that neither observer should be privileged over the other, yet the traveling twins' journey involves acceleration and deceleration, breaking the symmetry of the scenario and creating an objective difference in their aging rates. This paradox persists in our collective consciousness not because it represents an unsolved problem in physics, but rather because it challenges our intuitive understanding of time as a universal, unchanging constant that flows identically for all observers regardless of their circumstances. We continue to find fascination in the twin paradox despite decades of experimental confirmation and theoretical resolution, perhaps because it represents something deeply unsettling about the nature of reality itself, forcing us to confront the possibility that time is not the absolute reference frame we assumed it to be, and that the fundamental experience of aging and mortality might be fundamentally relative to our position and velocity in space. This realization opens up unsettling questions about the nature of identity itself. If one twin ages 50 years while the other ages only 5, are they still the same people who left Earth together, or has relativity fundamentally altered who they are at the most basic level? Perhaps the true paradox lies not in the physics, which is sound, but in our struggle to accept that time, that most intimate measure of our existence, can be negotiated and parceled out unequally depending on the arbitrary choices we make about how fast to move through space. Yet in this inequality lies a strange liberation. The paradox reminds us that time is not something that happens to us uniformly, but rather something we participate in creating through our choices and movements, suggesting that our subjective experience of duration is not merely an illusion, but a genuine feature of reality itself, woven into the fabric of space-time in ways that our conventional intuitions about causality and identity have yet to fully accommodate. In this sense, the twin paradox becomes not merely a thought experiment about physics, but a meditation on how our choices ripple through the very structure of time itself, reminding us that even in a determ. Imagine a donkey standing perfectly centered between two identical bales of hay, equidistant from both, with no reason to prefer one over the other. The donkey is equally hungry and equally capable of reaching either bale, yet it stands motionless, unable to make a choice. This is the premise of Buridan's ass, a thought experiment attributed to the medieval philosopher Jean Buridan, though he himself may never have intended it quite so literally. The paradox explores what happens when an agent faces two perfectly equal options and possesses no rational basis for choosing one alternative over the other, no distinguishing feature that would justify moving toward the left bale rather than the right, or vice versa. The problem becomes apparent immediately. If reason alone governs decision-making, and reason cannot identify a difference between the options, then the donkey should become paralyzed by indecision, unable to overcome the logical symmetry of the situation. Without some external force breaking the tie, without some arbitrary preference or distinguishing characteristic emerging from nowhere, the donkey theoretically could starve to death while standing between two meals. The mechanism underlying this paradox reveals something profound about how human beings and animals actually make decisions in the world. We rarely face truly identical options because our perceptions, biases, experiences, and even infinitesimal physical variations introduce asymmetries that our minds can seize upon. A donkey does not think in perfect geometric abstractions. It perceives slight differences in odor, texture, or distance that its senses can detect, allowing it to favor one bale over the other. Yet the paradox persists in philosophical discourse precisely because it exposes a gap between how we imagine rational choice working in theory and how creatures actually navigate the world in practice. We have normalized this gap by simply accepting that perfect symmetry never truly exists, that there is always some breaking point, some reason buried in the details that allows choice to proceed. In doing so, we have perhaps missed the deeper insight that sometimes choosing arbitrarily, without reason, without perfect justification, is not a failure of rationality, but rather a necessary condition of existence itself. A child choosing between two toys, a voter selecting between two candidates with nearly identical platforms, a person standing at a crossroads with equal opportunity in either direction. All of these are versions of Buridan's ass, and all of them proceed because we accept that some decisions require us to leap beyond reason, to embrace the freedom and responsibility of choosing without perfect justification. Perhaps this is why the donkey in Buridan's medieval imagination has become such an enduring symbol. It represents not a failure of logic, but a moment of truth about the human condition, that we are creatures capable of acting decisively even in the face of genuine uncertainty, and that this capacity, far from being irrational, may be our most distinctly human achievement. In this light, the donkey's paralysis becomes not a cautionary tale about the limits of reason, but an invitation to recognize that indecision itself is often a choice to remain suspended in contemplation rather than to act, and that sometimes the greatest wisdom lies not in finding the perfect justification, but in accepting that we must move forward despite the absence of one. Imagine two suspects arrested for a crime they may or may not have committed, held in separate interrogation rooms with no ability to communicate with one another, facing a choice that will determine their fates. The prosecutor presents each prisoner with an identical offer: betray your partner and testify against them in exchange for a reduced sentence, or remain silent and hope your partner does the same. If both remain silent, they each receive a light sentence based on insufficient evidence. If one betrays while the other stays quiet, the betrayer goes free, while the silent partner receives the harshest possible sentence. If both betray each other, they each receive a moderate sentence worse than mutual silence, but better than being the sole silent party. This setup creates a mathematical trap where individual rational self-interest directly conflicts with collective welfare, and what seems like the logical choice for each person independently produces the worst outcome when both make that same logical choice. The mechanism at work here involves what economists and game theorists call dominant strategy reasoning, where each player analyzes their situation assuming the worst about their partner's intentions, leading them to choose defection as the safest personal option regardless of what the other person does. This self-protective instinct makes betrayal seem rational, even though both parties would benefit enormously if they could somehow guarantee mutual cooperation. The paradox persists throughout human interactions because trust is fundamentally fragile and verification is expensive, making it persistently tempting to defect first before the other person gets the chance. And this dynamic repeats across negotiations, business deals, international relations, and countless social situations where mutual cooperation would benefit everyone but individual incentives push toward competitive behavior instead. The tragedy deepens because the dilemma reveals itself most acutely in situations where repetition and relationship matter most. Long-term partnerships, families, and communities where defection might offer short-term gains but destroys the possibility of future cooperation that would have been far more valuable. Yet paradoxically, humans have developed cultural institutions, legal frameworks, and reputation systems precisely to overcome this trap, suggesting that while our individual incentives pull toward betrayal, our collective intelligence recognizes that sustainable flourishing requires mechanisms that make cooperation safer and defection costlier. These mechanisms, from contract law to social media reputation to the evolution of reciprocal altruism in our brains, represent humanity's ongoing attempt to rewrite the game itself, transforming situations where defection dominates into ones where cooperation becomes the genuinely rational choice. Though the constant emergence of new contexts where trust hasn't yet been established means we remain perpetually vulnerable to the dilemma's logic. The most instructive cases may be those where we observe the dilemma actively unfolding in real time. Climate change negotiations, where nations rationally defect by prioritizing short-term economic growth. Arms races where security concerns drive mutual escalation, despite universal recognition that disarmament would serve everyone better, or online communities where anonymity removes reputational consequences and transforms the game back into its original. Imagine you are facing two closed boxes, and you must choose whether to take only box B or to take both box A and box B together. A mysterious predictor who has an almost perfect track record of accurately anticipating human choices has already made their preparations before you arrived at this moment. If the predictor believed you would take only box B, then box B contains $1 million, while box A contains nothing. However, if the predictor believed you would take both boxes, then box B contains nothing, while box A contains $1,000. The predictor has already sealed both boxes and left, and you have no way to change what is already inside them, yet your choice remains before you. The paradox emerges from two entirely rational lines of reasoning that lead to opposite conclusions, each seemingly airtight in its own logic. The first argument suggests you should take only box B, because the predictor's accuracy is nearly infallible, and if you take only box B, you will almost certainly receive $1 million. The predictor has already made their decision based on what they foresaw you doing, so your choice cannot change what is already in the boxes. The second argument, however, insists you should take both boxes, because the contents are already determined and fixed before you make your choice, so taking the additional box A can only add to your winnings or leave them unchanged, never diminishing what you receive. This reasoning suggests that taking both boxes is always the better strategy, regardless of what the predictor decided. What makes Newcomb's paradox so philosophically significant is that it forces us to confront fundamental questions about causality, decision-making, and the nature of rational choice itself. The paradox reveals an uncomfortable tension between what we might call causal decision theory, which focuses on how your actions causally affect future outcomes, and evidential decision theory, which suggests that your choice provides evidence about what the predictor must have foreseen. Most people find themselves intuitively drawn toward taking only box B, suggesting that our intuitions about rationality may incorporate a kind of backwards causality or temporal reasoning that our explicit logical frameworks struggle to accommodate. The persistence of this paradox in philosophical discourse demonstrates how deeply puzzling the relationship between prediction, choice, and causality remains, even after decades of rigorous analysis by brilliant minds. Some argue that the paradox ultimately hinges on whether we view ourselves as deterministic agents whose choices are predictable in principle, or as possessing a form of free will that could surprise even a perfect predictor, a distinction that touches the very heart of compatibilism and libertarian free will debates. In this sense, Newcomb's paradox serves less as a puzzle to be solved than as a mirror reflecting our deepest uncertainties about the nature of human agency itself. Yet perhaps the paradox's true value lies not in reaching a definitive answer, but in recognizing that our intuitions about rational decision-making may themselves be inconsistent or context-dependent, forcing us to examine whether the very concepts we use to reason about choice, causality, prediction, rationality, are as clear and settled as we assume them to be. Imagine a society that has built its foundation upon the principle of tolerance, where citizens celebrate their commitment to accepting diverse viewpoints, alternative lifestyles, and unconventional beliefs as a cornerstone of their democratic values. Yet within this very framework designed to protect freedom and diversity, a troubling tension emerges that the philosopher Karl Popper identified as the paradox of tolerance, a logical contradiction that sits at the heart of how free societies attempt to govern themselves and maintain their openness. The paradox presents itself in a deceptively simple question. If a tolerant society extends tolerance to intolerant groups, those intolerant groups may use the protections and freedoms afforded to them not to engage in good faith dialogue, but rather to dismantle tolerance itself and eventually eliminate the very freedoms that allowed them to flourish in the first place. Consider the real-world manifestation of this dilemma when a democratic nation grants freedom of speech to extremist movements whose explicit goal is to suppress the speech and rights of others. or when a government committed to equality permits the organization and expansion of groups dedicated to establishing hierarchies of human worth based on ethnicity, religion, or other characteristics. The logical mechanism underlying this paradox operates through a kind of weaponization of tolerance itself, wherein groups who reject the premise of mutual coexistence exploit the goodwill and openness of a tolerant society until they accumulate enough power and influence to overturn the very system that protected them. The psychological dimension involves a society's reluctance to abandon its cherished principles of openness even when confronted with movements that explicitly reject those principles, creating a paralysis where defending tolerance seems to require becoming intolerant, a contradiction that troubles the moral conscience of citizens who have internalized the value of accepting all perspectives. This paradox persists in contemporary society despite its logical clarity because enforcing limits on tolerance requires making subjective judgments about which movements are genuinely dangerous and which are merely unpopular, a power that citizens fear concentrating in any single authority, whether governmental, corporate, or social. Yet history demonstrates repeatedly that unchecked intolerant movements have toppled tolerant societies, suggesting that perhaps some degree of intolerance toward intolerance itself may be not merely acceptable but necessary, a conclusion that sits uncomfortably against the very values that define open societies. The challenge then becomes determining the precise threshold at which a society must defend itself, whether through legal restrictions, social ostracism, or counterspeech, without transforming into the very tyranny it seeks to prevent, a calculation that remains perpetually contested in courtrooms, town halls, and the court of public opinion. This tension manifests acutely in questions about deplatforming, content moderation, and whether societies should prohibit hate speech preemptively or allow it to be countered through more speech. Each approach carrying its own risks of either suppressing legitimate dissent or enabling the gradual normalization of movements that threaten pluralism itself. Consider the person who pursues pleasure above all else, who arranges their entire life around the maximization of enjoyable experiences and the avoidance of discomfort, believing that this singular focus will lead them to a state of complete happiness and fulfillment. They seek out entertainment, indulgence, leisure, and sensory gratification with unwavering dedication, carefully constructing each day around activities that promise immediate satisfaction and delight. Yet despite this relentless pursuit, despite achieving many of the pleasurable experiences they desire, they often find themselves experiencing a peculiar emptiness, a sense that something essential remains missing, that the happiness they expected to find through pure hedonistic dedication continues to elude them. The paradox emerges from the strange mechanics of human psychology itself, wherein the direct pursuit of pleasure as a primary goal often undermines the very achievement of that pleasure. Happiness and satisfaction seem to arrive most reliably not through their direct pursuit, but rather as byproducts of engaging in meaningful activities, building genuine relationships, pursuing accomplishments, contributing to something larger than oneself, or working toward valued goals that transcend simple comfort. When we fixate exclusively on pleasure as the objective, we become hyper-aware of whether we are achieving it, we second-guess our experiences, we become anxious about whether the pleasure is sufficient or lasting, and paradoxically, this self-consciousness and instrumental attitude toward our own happiness often prevents us from fully experiencing the very pleasure we sought. The mechanism resembles trying to fall asleep by forcing yourself to sleep rather than simply relaxing and allowing sleep to come naturally. We have somehow normalized this paradox within our culture by simultaneously promoting both the pursuit of pleasure and expressing confusion about why pure hedonism fails to satisfy, yet rarely acknowledging that perhaps the design of human fulfillment simply does not align with the hedonistic algorithm. The paradox persists because pleasure remains genuinely desirable and valuable, but its pursuit works best when it is not the ultimate aim, when it emerges instead as a natural consequence of living thoughtfully and purposefully. The person who finds genuine joy in meaningful work, authentic connection, or creative struggle often experiences more lasting satisfaction than the one who methodically samples experiences from a pleasure menu. This inversion, where happiness becomes most accessible when we stop treating it as the destination and instead focus on the journey itself, suggests that perhaps the deepest human satisfactions emerge not from the architecture of pleasure, but from the architecture of purpose. The irony sharpens when we recognize that many of history's most fulfilled individuals, artists, scientists, activists, parents often sacrificed immediate comfort for their chosen pursuits, yet reported greater contentment than those who never had to choose, suggesting that perhaps the resistance itself, the friction of striving toward something beyond ourselves, contains an essential ingredient that pure pleasure simply cannot provide. This suggests that human flourishing may require a certain productive tension between desire and discipline, between comfort and challenge, making the hedonist's dream of frictionless satisfaction not merely difficult to achieve. Consider the curious experience of reading a novel or watching a film, during which you find yourself genuinely moved by events that you simultaneously know have never occurred and involve characters that have never existed. You sit in a darkened theater watching a character you have never met face a dilemma you recognize as invented, and yet your heart rate increases, your palms grow damp, and tears form in your eyes as though witnessing something profoundly real. This is the paradox of fiction, a phenomenon so deeply embedded in human experience that we rarely pause to examine its fundamental strangeness. When you learn that a beloved character dies in a story you are following, you experience genuine grief, complete with the neurological signatures of authentic sorrow, despite possessing complete knowledge that this character exists only as words on a page or pixels on a screen. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through what philosophers and psychologists call a willing suspension of disbelief, wherein the conscious mind maintains full awareness of fictionality, while the emotional and imaginative systems respond as though the events were real. Your rational faculties never actually forget that what you are experiencing is constructed and false, yet this knowledge does not prevent your body from mobilizing genuine emotional responses. The paradox deepens when we consider that you do not respond this way to false statements presented as facts in your actual life, yet you respond profoundly to statements you explicitly recognize as inventions. What makes this persistence so remarkable is that we have somehow normalized this split consciousness so thoroughly that most people move through fictional experiences without experiencing any cognitive dissonance whatsoever. We accept that pretense can generate authenticity, that the false can produce the genuine, that imagination can bypass our rational defenses in ways that deliberate deception cannot. And we continue this practice throughout our entire lives without resolving the fundamental logical tension at its core. Perhaps this acceptance reveals something profound about human consciousness itself, that we are fundamentally creatures who do not merely process reality, but who actively construct meaning through narrative, and that this capacity for imaginative engagement may be as essential to our psychological functioning as our ability to perceive the world accurately. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are, the futures we imagine, and the meanings we assign to our lives are all products of this same imaginative faculty, suggesting that the boundary between fiction and reality may be less a wall than a permeable membrane through which we constantly move, constructing the narratives that ultimately construct us. In this light, the paradox dissolves somewhat. We are not suspended between fiction and reality so much as we are creatures for whom meaning-making through narrative is itself the primary reality. The stories we live by, about our identities, our relationships, our place in the world, are no less constructed than the novels we read, yet no less constitutive of who we actually become. To recognize this is to understand that the novel you finish tonight and the life you live tomorrow are not fundamentally different in their capacity to shape who you become. Both are narratives we inhabit, both are fictions that remake us through the act of believing in them. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a river in ancient times, watching a crocodile emerge from the water with a child in its jaws, and the crocodile speaks to you with a peculiar proposition. It claims that if you can correctly guess whether it will eat the child or return the child to safety, then it will grant you the outcome you predict. But if you guess incorrectly, the opposite will occur, leaving you in a state of profound logical paralysis where language itself becomes a trap. This ancient thought experiment, which has persisted through centuries of philosophical discourse, presents a situation where the very act of making a prediction about the crocodile's behavior creates a self-referential loop that cannot be resolved through ordinary logic, much like trying to step outside of language while using language to do so. The mechanism that makes this paradox function relies on the assumption that the crocodile must keep its promise while simultaneously following its own nature, creating two incompatible obligations that pull in opposite directions with equal force and inevitability. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is how it exposes the limitations of binary thinking and promise-keeping in situations where the premises themselves contain hidden contradictions that refuse to yield to rational analysis or straightforward deliberation. We encounter versions of this dilemma throughout human experience whenever we face situations where honesty itself becomes logically impossible, where telling the truth about what will happen next somehow makes the truth impossible to tell. Yet we continue to expect people to navigate these impossible territories with consistency and moral clarity despite their fundamental irresolvability. Perhaps this is why we find ourselves drawn to such paradoxes in moments of genuine moral crisis. When a promise to a friend conflicts with a promise to ourselves, or when loyalty to one person demands betrayal of another, we recognize in the crocodile's impossible bargain a shadow of our own lived experience, where the only way forward sometimes requires accepting that we cannot satisfy all our commitments simultaneously and must choose which truths to honor. In this sense, the crocodile becomes less a literal threat and more a mirror reflecting back our recognition that maturity often means accepting paradox as a permanent feature of moral life rather than a problem waiting to be solved. The wisdom lies not in finding the logical escape route, but in developing the courage to act decisively even when the ground beneath our reasoning has become fundamentally unstable. This is perhaps why the ancient crocodile paradox never truly dies. Each generation must learn anew that some of life's most important decisions cannot wait for logical certainty, and that choosing to act anyway, with humility about our limitations, becomes itself a form of wisdom that no perfect argument could ever provide. The crocodile waits not for our perfect understanding but for our response, and in that waiting, we discover that the most honest answer we can give is often simply, "I will do what I believe is right, knowing I may be wrong, and I will bear the consequences of that choice." When we finally speak such words, the paradox loses its paralyzing grip, not because we have solved it logically, but because we have moved beyond the need for logical perfection as a prerequisite for moral action. Imagine a being that possesses complete and perfect knowledge of all things, past, present, and future, a consciousness so comprehensive that it knows every event that will ever occur before it happens, every choice that will be made, every word that will be spoken across all of eternity. This is the concept of omniscience, and it creates a profound logical puzzle that has troubled philosophers and theologians for centuries. If such a being knows with absolute certainty that a particular person will make a specific choice at a specific moment in time, then that choice cannot truly be free, because the outcome is already determined and known. The person making the choice has no genuine ability to do otherwise, for if they could do otherwise, then the omniscient being's knowledge would have been incorrect, which is impossible by definition. Yet we simultaneously want to maintain that free will exists, that our choices are meaningful and authentically ours, that we possess genuine agency in shaping our actions and our futures. This creates an irreconcilable tension between the concept of omniscience and the concept of free will, two things that seem logically incompatible and yet are both deeply important to our understanding of consciousness, morality, and the nature of reality itself. The paradox persists because we are unwilling to surrender either notion, even though they appear to contradict each other fundamentally. We continue to believe that some form of superior knowledge is possible, while simultaneously insisting that human choice remains genuinely free, as though these two truths might somehow coexist in a space we cannot fully comprehend, in a dimension of logic that transcends our ordinary understanding of causality and determination. Perhaps this is why theologians have proposed solutions like divine timelessness, the idea that an omniscient being exists outside of time altogether, perceiving all moments simultaneously as an eternal present, and thus knowledge of future events need not constrain their occurrence. Yet even this elegant formulation merely relocates the paradox rather than resolving it, for if all moments are equally present to such a being, then the distinction between knowing and causing becomes itself uncertain. We are left, then, with a question that may ultimately be unanswerable, whether the paradox reveals a genuine limit to what can logically exist, or whether it merely exposes the boundaries of human reasoning, a frontier where our categories of knowledge, time, and freedom simply fail to apply. Perhaps we might find a clue in considering that the paradox assumes knowledge and causation operate on the same plane, when they may be fundamentally different orders of reality. Much as a novelist knows every decision their characters will make without that knowledge forcing those decisions into being, since the characters exist in a different ontological order than the author who comprehends them. Yet this analogy too reveals its own limitations, for unlike fictional characters, we experience ourselves as genuinely undetermined, as sources of spontaneous choice rather than predetermined narrative elements, and an omniscient being would presumably know the difference between true freedom and mere illusion of it, leaving us once again at the edge of the abyss. Imagine a situation where someone discovers a truth that has never been known before, a fact about the world that exists as an objective reality but has remained hidden from human awareness until this very moment. And in discovering this truth, they face an unexpected logical problem that seems to undermine the very nature of knowledge itself. Fitch's paradox, formulated by the philosopher Frederick Fitch in 1963, presents us with a deceptively simple logical argument that appears to prove something profoundly troubling. That if there exists any unknown truth at all, then it must be impossible for that truth to ever become known, which would mean that unknown truths cannot transition into known truths without creating a logical contradiction. The mechanics of this paradox work through a chain of reasoning that begins with the assumption that somewhere in the universe there exists at least one true statement that nobody currently knows, a proposition that seems not only reasonable but obviously true, since human knowledge is surely incomplete and limited. If we accept that this unknown truth exists, then we can represent it logically as a statement P that is true but not known by anyone, and from this representation, Fitch demonstrates through formal logical steps that acknowledging the existence of such an unknown truth leads inevitably to a contradiction, because if P is an unknown truth, then the statement that P is unknown and true would itself be a compound truth, and if someone could come to know this compound statement, they would then know that P is true, which would mean P is no longer unknown, creating a paradox that seems to suggest either that all truths must be known or that no unknown truths can exist at all. This paradox persists in philosophical discourse despite its logical severity, because it challenges our most basic intuitions about the nature of reality and knowledge, forcing us to confront uncomfortable questions about whether objective truths can exist independently of any mind to know them, and whether the very concept of an unknown truth contains an inherent logical flaw that we have somehow overlooked or accepted without scrutiny. We continue to speak and think as though unknown truths exist everywhere around us, truths about distant galaxies and microscopic particles and historical events that happened before humans evolved. Yet this paradox suggests that such a casual acceptance may rest upon a foundation far more unstable than we realized. The paradox becomes even more unsettling when we consider that rejecting unknown truths entirely would require us to accept that the universe contains only truths that are currently known by someone, somewhere, a position so counterintuitive that most philosophers find it harder to accept than the paradox itself, leaving us trapped between two seemingly impossible conclusions. Yet this very impasse reveals something profound about the limits of logic itself. Perhaps the paradox persists not because reality is fundamentally flawed, but because our formal systems of reasoning, designed to capture truth in precise symbolic language, may simply be inadequate tools for addressing the relationship between knowledge, existence, and consciousness. When we examine how Fitch's paradox emerges from the marriage of formal logic and epistemology, we find ourselves at the boundary where mathematical precision meets the messy reality of human cognition and experience. Imagine standing in a room and declaring to your friend with complete sincerity, "It is raining outside, but I do not believe that it is raining outside." The moment you speak these words, something feels profoundly wrong, even though from a purely logical standpoint, there is nothing contradictory about the sentence itself. This is Moore's paradox, named after the 20th century philosopher George Edward Moore, who first identified this peculiar linguistic and cognitive phenomenon that seems to violate no actual laws of logic, yet feels utterly absurd whenever anyone attempts to assert it. The paradox reveals a strange gap between what is logically possible and what is practically assertable, between the realm of abstract truth and the realm of human communication and sincerity. When you make an assertion, you are not merely stating a fact about the world. You are simultaneously expressing your belief in that fact, and to assert something while denying your belief in it creates a performative contradiction, a breakdown in the very act of communication itself. This is not a contradiction in the proposition alone, but rather a contradiction between what you are saying and what you are implicitly claiming about your own mental state through the act of saying it. The mechanism behind this peculiar feeling operates at the intersection of language, belief, and sincerity, where assertion functions as more than mere propositional content and instead serves as a social contract between speaker and listener. When you assert something, you are not just uttering words, You're claiming knowledge, expressing conviction, and inviting your listener to trust your epistemic authority on the matter at hand. To simultaneously deny belief in what you assert is to betray this implicit social function of assertion, to undermine the very foundation upon which meaningful communication rests. Yet despite this understanding, despite knowing precisely why Moore's paradox feels so wrong and so impossible to genuinely assert, we continue to encounter situations where this paradox manifests in subtler forms throughout human life and experience. People often act in ways that contradict their stated beliefs, creating echoes of Moore's paradox in the gap between declaration and action, between what they claim to believe and how they actually behave. When someone insists they believe in climate change while consistently making choices that ignore it, or declares their commitment to a relationship while their actions suggest otherwise, they are caught in a modern manifestation of Moore's paradox, not speaking the contradiction aloud, but living it nonetheless, and perhaps experiencing a quiet discomfort that mirrors the absurdity Moore first identified. This lived contradiction may even be more troubling than the linguistic version, because it suggests that Moore's paradox is not merely a quirk of language, but a fundamental tension in human nature itself. The constant struggle between our stated values and our actual commitments, between who we believe ourselves to be and who our choices reveal us to be. In this sense, recognizing Moore's paradox in our own lives becomes an invitation to greater honesty, not just in what we say, but in the alignment between our words and our deeds. Perhaps the deepest lesson Moore's paradox offers is that sincerity itself demands a kind of integrity we are rarely willing to examine too closely. Consider the moment when you find yourself facing a question that you genuinely do not know the answer to, and yet you must somehow find that answer through inquiry and investigation. This presents us with what philosophers have called the paradox of inquiry, a puzzle that emerges when we contemplate the very nature of learning and discovery itself. The paradox unfolds in a deceptively simple way. If you already know what you're searching for, then there is no genuine inquiry taking place, for you have already found it before you began your search. Conversely, if you do not know what you're searching for, then how could you possibly recognize it when you encounter it, and how could you even begin to search for something that remains completely unknown to you? This ancient dilemma appears to suggest that all inquiry is logically impossible, that we cannot genuinely learn anything new because learning requires either prior knowledge that makes learning unnecessary or complete ignorance that makes learning impossible. The mechanism underlying this paradox reveals something fundamental about how human beings conceptualize knowledge and discovery. When we engage in inquiry, we are somehow navigating between these two seemingly incompatible states, maintaining a peculiar middle ground where we know enough to direct our search, but not so much that the search becomes redundant. We possess partial knowledge, intuitions, fragments of understanding, and contextual clues that guide us toward answers we have not yet fully grasped. Yet our logical frameworks struggle to accommodate this intermediate state, insisting instead on binary categories of either knowing or not knowing. In our everyday lives, we have normalized this paradox so thoroughly that we rarely acknowledge its existence at all. Every student who pursues education, every researcher who conducts an experiment, every person who explores an unfamiliar topic operates within this supposed impossibility without hesitation or concern. We conduct inquiry constantly, treating it as unremarkable, and we succeed in learning despite the logical contradiction that supposedly prevents us from doing so. The paradox persists not because the world refuses to cooperate with our logic, but because our initial understanding of knowledge itself may be too rigid, too categorical, and insufficiently nuanced to capture the genuine complexity of how human minds actually encounter, seek, and integrate new information. When we recognize that knowing exists on a spectrum rather than as a binary switch, that we can know enough to ask the right questions while remaining ignorant of the answers, the paradox dissolves not because we have solved it logically, but because we have expanded our conception of what knowledge actually is. This shift from seeing inquiry as impossible to seeing it as the natural expression of partial understanding transforms one of philosophy's most vexing puzzles into one of our most ordinary and beautiful capacities. The child learning to speak encounters thousands of words before mastering any single one, gradually narrowing the vast space of possible meanings through repeated exposure and gentle correction. In this way, inquiry is not a leap from ignorance to knowledge, but a patient accumulation of partial understandings that eventually crystallizes into something we can confidently call knowing. Imagine that neuroscientists have developed a machine of perfect technological sophistication, one so advanced that it can stimulate your brain in precisely the ways needed to create any experience you desire, indistinguishable from reality itself. You could experience climbing mountains, falling in love, achieving great accomplishments, traveling to exotic places, or living any life you could possibly imagine, all while your body remains in a vat, connected to electrodes and nutrient tubes. The experiences would feel completely real to you, neurologically identical to actual experiences, yet they would be simulations generated entirely by the machine. The question that emerges from this scenario is deceptively simple yet philosophically profound. Would you plug in? Most people instinctively recoil from this prospect, even though the machine offers perfect happiness, endless pleasure, and every experience one could want. The mechanism underlying this reluctance reveals something fundamental about human values and what we actually care about beyond mere sensation. We seem to care deeply about something beyond the subjective quality of our experiences, something related to whether those experiences are real, whether we are genuinely accomplishing things in the actual world, whether our relationships are authentic connections with real people rather than simulations in our minds. This suggests that human well-being cannot be reduced entirely to the states of consciousness we experience, that reality itself matters to us in a way that goes beyond how it makes us feel. Yet despite recognizing this intuition, we have normalized in many aspects of modern life a kind of gradual approach toward the experience machine itself. We spend hours in virtual realities, constructing curated versions of our lives on social media that bear only selective resemblance to our actual experiences, consuming entertainment that simulates emotions and narrative arcs rather than engaging with the messy reality around us. We have become increasingly comfortable with mediated experiences, replacing direct engagement with the world and other people. The paradox persists because we have learned to rationalize these choices through convenience and pleasure, even as some part of us recognizes that we may be sacrificing something essential about authentic engagement with reality. The question is not whether we will plug in entirely, but whether we are already plugged in partway, and at what point the accumulated simulations and mediations begin to hollow out the very reality we sought to escape from in the first place. Perhaps the deepest insight is that the experience machine reveals a hidden truth. We are not purely rational agents choosing based on conscious deliberation, but beings whose values are fundamentally tied to genuine agency and authentic connection, even when we cannot fully articulate why these things matter more than perfect contentment. The machine thus becomes a mirror held up to our actual choices, forcing us to confront whether the lives we are living, with their struggles, uncertainties, and genuine stakes, are the ones we truly value, or whether we have simply become skilled at not noticing how far we've already traveled down the path toward the vat. The discomfort we feel when truly confronting this choice may be the most honest thing we ever learn about ourselves, a clarity we desperately need in an age that profits from our willing self-deception. Imagine a neuroscientist named Mary who has spent her entire life in a black and white room, never having experienced color directly, yet possessing complete knowledge of the physical facts about color perception, wavelengths of light, neural responses in the visual cortex, and every measurable aspect of how human beings process chromatic information. She knows the physics perfectly, understands the biology completely, and could explain with absolute precision how light of 650 nanometers interacts with cone cells in the retina to produce the experience of red. But then one day Mary leaves her monochromatic chamber and encounters the world in full color for the first time, and she experiences what it is actually like to see red, to witness the warm vibrancy of a sunset or the brilliant crimson of a rose petal. The philosophical puzzle at the heart of this thought experiment asks us whether Mary has learned something genuinely new despite having possessed all possible physical knowledge beforehand, and this question cuts to the very foundation of our understanding about consciousness and subjective experience. The mechanism underlying this paradox reveals a fundamental gap between two different kinds of knowledge: objective, quantifiable, third-person information about how systems work versus the irreducible, qualitative, first-person experience of what something is actually like, what philosophers call qualia or phenomenal consciousness. Even armed with every fact about the neural machinery and physical processes involved, no amount of descriptive or propositional knowledge can substitute for the direct lived experience of sensory sensation, suggesting that consciousness contains something that transcends pure physical description. We continue to feel the intuitive force of this puzzle because our ordinary experience consistently reveals this divide between knowing about something and knowing it directly, between understanding the mechanism and living the reality, and despite centuries of scientific progress that has mapped vast territories of the physical world, we have not eliminated this persistent gap between objective fact and subjective experience. When we try to imagine Mary's first encounter with red, we recognize that no textbook description of wavelengths or neural firing patterns could have prepared her for that singular moment of chromatic revelation. And this intuition suggests that consciousness possesses a texture and dimensionality that our current scientific frameworks may be fundamentally unable to capture or explain, pointing toward either a limitation in our methods of understanding or a genuine mystery at the heart of sentient experience itself. Some philosophers have argued that Mary's release from her room demonstrates that physicalism, the view that everything, including consciousness, is ultimately physical, cannot be the whole story, while others counter that she merely acquires new abilities or different ways of accessing information she already possessed. Yet the debate itself remains unresolved precisely because we lack adequate conceptual tools to bridge the explanatory chasm between objective description and subjective sensation. The persistence of this puzzle across decades of philosophical debate suggests that the hard problem of consciousness, explaining why physical processes give rise to subjective experience at all, may represent a fundamental boundary in human knowledge, a question that challenges not. Imagine a being that is physically identical to you in every measurable way, possessing the same body, the same brain structure, the same neural patterns, and the same behavioral responses to stimuli. Yet when this creature sees the color red or tastes the sweetness of honey or feels the warmth of sunlight, there is nothing it is like to experience these things from the inside. This is the philosophical zombie, a thought experiment that challenges our understanding of consciousness and the relationship between the physical and the mental. The zombie behaves exactly as you do, speaks about its experiences in the same way you would, reports feeling pain when pricked and joy when celebrated, yet remains completely empty of subjective experience throughout, a hollow automaton going through the motions of sentience without any inner life whatsoever. This paradox emerges from a fundamental question about consciousness that has troubled philosophers for centuries. If we can imagine in perfect detail a physically identical being that lacks subjective experience entirely, then doesn't consciousness require something beyond mere physical matter? The mechanism underlying this thought experiment operates by separating what philosophers call qualia, the raw subjective feeling of experience, from all the physical and functional properties we associate with consciousness. We can describe every neural firing, every behavioral output, every cognitive process in complete physical detail, and yet when we imagine removing the subjective element from this entire physical picture, we find that nothing logically contradicts this removal. The zombie's philosophical power lies in this conceptual separation, suggesting that consciousness might involve something non-physical, or that our understanding of physical explanation itself contains a fundamental gap. What makes this paradox particularly persistent in philosophical discourse is that it remains genuinely unresolved whether such zombies are actually conceivable or logically possible, or whether our intuition that they are possible merely reflects the limits of our understanding rather than the limits of physical explanation. We continue to debate whether consciousness is ultimately explainable in physical terms alone, or whether some aspect of subjective experience necessarily transcends any purely material description, all the while accepting that we cannot access anyone else's inner experience to verify whether anyone around us might already be such a being. This uncertainty has profound implications. It suggests that consciousness might be the one aspect of reality that resists complete scientific explanation, or alternatively, that we may one day discover consciousness emerges necessarily from physical organization in ways we currently cannot articulate. Either way, the philosophical zombie forces us to confront whether our science can ever fully bridge the explanatory gap between objective physical facts and subjective experiential truths. Perhaps the most unsettling implication is that the philosophical zombie reveals consciousness as fundamentally private and untestable. We can never be certain that the people we love and interact with daily possess inner experience rather than merely simulating it, a realization that challenges not just our science, but our ethics and our ability to truly know another mind. Imagine a person who has lived their entire life in a laboratory, raised in isolation from the natural world, studying books and images and descriptions of swamps without ever having experienced one directly. And then one day this person is taken into an actual swamp where they encounter real plants and real water and real mud and real organisms, and they walk through this swamp for hours, observing it with their own senses, feeling the humidity on their skin, hearing the sounds of insects and frogs, smelling the decomposing matter beneath their feet, and they form memories of this experience that are now encoded in their brain through direct neural pathways that connect to actual perceptions. Now imagine another person, identical in every way, who has never been to a swamp but lives in the same laboratory, and this second person has learned everything the first person knows about swamps through the same books and images and descriptions. So they have identical knowledge in every measurable sense, identical thoughts, identical memory structures, yet they have never had the actual sensory experience themselves. The question becomes whether these two people actually mean the same thing when they use the word swamp, whether their thought about swamps refers to the same thing in the world, because the first person's thoughts are causally connected to the actual swamp through their experience of it, while the second person's thoughts are merely internally structured knowledge with no causal connection to any actual swamp. This paradox, known as Swampman, challenges the fundamental assumption that meaning and reference are determined entirely by internal mental states and the structure of ideas within the mind, suggesting instead that what our thoughts mean depends critically on their causal history and their external world connections. And yet, despite this insight into how meaning actually works in the world, we continue to believe in many contexts that pure thought alone can constitute genuine understanding. That someone could truly comprehend something without any real-world connection to it, that knowledge exists entirely as internal structures independent of the world that gave rise to those structures. We see this contradiction play out constantly in education, where we assume that reading about photosynthesis or revolution or love is equivalent to understanding them, when perhaps genuine comprehension requires some form of causal engagement with the world, not necessarily direct experience, but at minimum, a real connection between our minds and the phenomena we claim to understand, a tether that grounds our abstractions in something actual and external to our own thoughts. Perhaps this is why the most transformative learning experiences often involve some element of genuine encounter. The student who volunteers in a hospital understands medicine differently than one who only reads textbooks. The activist who organizes in a community grasps political change more deeply than the theorist in the ivory tower. And even the reader who allows a novel to change their emotional landscape has formed a causal connection to something real. A genuine interaction between their mind and another's embodied experience rendered in language. Yet even this recognition does not fully resolve the paradox, because we must acknowledge that all understanding exists on a spectrum of causal connection, and perhaps the task is not to achieve perfect external reference, but to honestly. Imagine you are sitting in your office on a Tuesday afternoon, and your colleague Sarah mentions that the person who will get the promotion has a 10-year-old son. You have always believed that Sarah is reliable and truthful, so you form the belief that the person who will get the promotion has a 10-year-old son. Later that day, you learn that you yourself are getting the promotion, and you also happen to have a 10-year-old son. Your belief turned out to be true, and you had good reasons for holding it based on Sarah's testimony, yet something feels philosophically unsettling about calling this knowledge in the traditional sense. This scenario represents the core challenge posed by the Gettier problem, a fundamental puzzle about what distinguishes genuine knowledge from mere true belief supported by good reasoning. The classical definition of knowledge, established since Plato, suggests that knowledge requires three elements: belief, truth, and justification. You believed the proposition was indeed true, and you had justified reasons for believing it through a reliable source. Yet most philosophers and intuitive thinkers alike resist calling this knowledge because your justification connected to the truth in an accidental or lucky way rather than through a direct causal or logical relationship. The mechanism underlying this puzzle involves the recognition that having good reasons for a belief does not guarantee that those reasons actually connect properly to why the belief happens to be true. Your justification was based on Sarah's statement about someone with a son getting promoted, but the real reason your belief was true had nothing to do with Sarah's knowledge or intention. It was true only because you yourself possessed the relevant property. This gap between justified true belief and knowledge reveals that our intuitive understanding of knowledge involves something beyond these three traditional components, perhaps a requirement that the justification must be appropriately connected to the truth in a non-accidental manner. The persistence of this problem in contemporary philosophy demonstrates how deeply embedded our assumptions about knowledge remain even after centuries of philosophical scrutiny, and how readily our rational minds can construct scenarios where the traditional framework breaks down while our intuitions about what counts as genuine knowledge refuse to follow the logical conclusion we might expect. Philosophers have proposed various solutions, from requiring a causal connection between justification and truth, to demanding that beliefs be formed through reliable processes, to abandoning the justified true belief framework altogether. Yet none has achieved universal acceptance, suggesting that the problem touches on something fundamental about how we distinguish lucky coincidence from genuine understanding. The Gettier problem thus serves as a reminder that knowledge is not merely a psychological state, but rather involves a kind of epistemic integrity, a harmony between our reasons for belief and the world's actual structure, making it one of the most consequential puzzles for understanding how we relate to truth itself. Consider how this problem extends beyond academic philosophy into everyday life. A doctor might correctly diagnose a patient's illness based on sound medical reasoning, yet unknowingly misread a test result that happened to point toward the correct disease anyway, raising unsettling questions abo. Imagine waking up in a hospital bed to discover that a world-renowned violinist, who is dying from a rare kidney disease, has been connected to your circulatory system overnight without your consent. The violinist's kidneys no longer function, and the only way to save their life is to keep them connected to you for 9 months, during which time their body will develop the ability to survive independently. The hospital authorities inform you that you are the only person whose blood type matches, and if you disconnect yourself from this violinist, they will certainly die within hours. You never agreed to this arrangement, your body is being used without permission, and your physical autonomy has been completely overridden by circumstances entirely beyond your control. Yet the violinist will live if you simply remain connected, sacrificing 9 months of your normal life to serve as a living dialysis machine. This scenario, constructed by philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson in her groundbreaking 1971 essay, presents a thought experiment designed to challenge our intuitions about bodily autonomy, moral obligation, and the nature of responsibility. The mechanism at work here involves a fundamental tension between two competing moral principles that most of us intuitively hold simultaneously. On one hand, we believe we have an absolute right to control what happens to our own bodies and to refuse to have our physical integrity invaded or commandeered for any reason, even to save another person's life. On the other hand, we also believe we have strong moral duties to help others when we can do so at minimal cost to ourselves, and we typically condemn people who refuse easy opportunities to prevent serious harm. Thomson's violinist forces these principles into direct collision, and most people, when confronted with this scenario, report feeling that they would be morally permitted to disconnect themselves, even though doing so would kill an innocent person. Yet we have constructed an entire legal and social framework around the assumption that women do not possess this fundamental right to bodily autonomy in the context of pregnancy and reproduction. We have normalized the idea that a woman's body can be commandeered for 9 months to sustain another human being, without her consent being treated as truly voluntary or inviolable. The paradox persists because we have learned to see pregnancy as fundamentally different from the violinist scenario, as though the circumstances of biological reproduction somehow eliminate the right to bodily autonomy that we grant so freely in every other context. Yet this distinction collapses under scrutiny. If we would not force someone to donate a kidney to save a stranger's life, or even to donate blood or bone marrow, why should we compel women to undergo the far greater physical ordeal, medical risk, and permanent bodily changes that pregnancy entails? The violinist scenario reveals that our moral intuitions about bodily autonomy are not actually conditional on biological relationship or reproductive capacity. They are fundamental rights that we have simply chosen to suspend in one context alone. The discomfort we feel when confronting this inconsistency suggests that our resistance to granting women reproductive autonomy may rest not on principled moral grounds, but on centuries of assumptions about women's bodies as inherently available for collective use. Imagine yourself standing at the threshold of a society you have never seen before, a world whose rules and structures remain entirely unknown to you. You are about to be placed into this society, but you have no idea what role you will occupy, what circumstances you will inherit, or what advantages or disadvantages will define your existence. You do not know if you will be born into wealth or poverty, health or sickness, privilege or marginalization, majority or minority status. This is the philosophical thought experiment known as the veil of ignorance, conceived by political philosopher John Rawls as a method for determining what principles of justice would be truly fair. The mechanism behind this exercise operates on a profound psychological principle. When we remove the knowledge of our own position within a social hierarchy, we become forced to consider principles that would be acceptable regardless of where we ourselves might land. If you do not know whether you will be the powerful or the powerless, the wealthy or the struggling, you are far more likely to advocate for systems that protect the vulnerable and distribute resources equitably rather than systems that concentrate advantage among the few. The logical elegance of this thought experiment reveals something striking about human morality. We are capable of extraordinary fairness when self-interest cannot bias our judgment. Yet despite understanding this principle intellectually, societies continue to function largely based on the opposite mechanism, where those with knowledge of their advantaged positions structure rules to maintain those advantages without regard for the veil of ignorance. We have normalized an arrangement where fairness is optional rather than foundational, where the powerful need not imagine themselves powerless, and where the structures we build reflect the interests of those who build them rather than principles that would satisfy any rational person behind such a veil. The paradox persists because actually implementing Rawlsian justice would require those currently behind the veil of advantage to voluntarily cede some portion of it, a transformation that remains one of history's most elusive achievements. Yet perhaps the veil's true power lies not in convincing the advantaged to surrender their position, but in offering those without power a framework for demanding change, a philosophical mirror in which injustice becomes undeniable, and the question shifts from "why should I give this up?" to "how could this ever have been considered just?" When marginalized communities invoke this principle, demanding criminal justice reform, equitable health care, educational access, or economic opportunity, they are essentially asking society to answer Rawls's fundamental question: would you design these systems if you didn't know which side of them you would occupy? In this sense, the veil of ignorance transforms from abstract philosophy into a practical tool of moral accountability, one that forces the privileged to confront the arbitrary nature of their position and the unjustifiability of systems that would horrify them if the dice of birth were rolled differently. The most transformative societies are those that periodically subject their institutions to this test, asking not whether current arrangements benefit those in power, but whether they could justify them to someone who might emerge anywhere within their structure. Imagine yourself standing behind a thick veil of complete ignorance, unable to see who you will become in the world you are about to enter, uncertain whether you will be born wealthy or impoverished, healthy or chronically ill, privileged by circumstances of geography and family or disadvantaged by them. And from this position of radical uncertainty, you must design the fundamental rules and structures that will govern an entire society that you will then have to live within. Not knowing which position in that society you yourself will occupy once the veil is lifted and you discover your actual place. This is the thought experiment known as the original position, conceived by philosopher John Rawls as a method for determining what justice actually means and how a fair society should be organized, transforming the abstract question of social contract into something deeply personal and consequential. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates on the recognition that our judgments about fairness are systematically distorted by our knowledge of our own positions and interests, causing us to rationalize existing inequalities and accept unjust arrangements because we happen to benefit from them, while those who suffer from inequality dismiss their own disadvantage through psychological mechanisms of acceptance and normalization. When we remove the knowledge of where we stand, we are forced to reason from what Rawls termed pure procedural justice, considering only those principles that we would find acceptable regardless of which social position we inherited, which fundamentally means that we would likely reject systems built on radical inequality or exploitation, since we could not guarantee that we ourselves would not end up as the exploited. Yet despite the logical force of this reasoning, actual societies continue to perpetuate significant inequalities that few would design if they were truly reasoning from behind the veil, suggesting that we have constructed elaborate psychological and ideological mechanisms to justify existing hierarchies, convincing ourselves and others that these arrangements are natural, inevitable, or deserved. rather than contingent results of chance that could have been different if designed by people who genuinely did not know what position they would occupy. The power of Rawls's thought experiment lies not in its ability to perfectly describe how societies actually form, but in its capacity to serve as a mirror held up to our existing institutions, revealing the gap between the principles we claim to endorse when reasoning impartially and the arrangements we defend when our own interests are at stake, making it a perpetual moral challenge to societies that aspire to fairness even if they can never fully achieve it. This is why the original position remains relevant not as a blueprint for perfect justice, but as a diagnostic tool. Each time we encounter a policy or institution that we would reject if we did not know our place within it, we have identified a point where our actual society has drifted from the principles we would endorse under conditions of genuine impartiality, and conversely, those arrangements we would accept regardless of position become candidates for the kind of basic structure that a truly fair society might approximate. Imagine a billionaire offers you $1 million with a simple condition. You must intend to drink a deadly toxin tomorrow that will make you violently ill for 10 hours, though it will cause no permanent damage. The catch is that you only receive the money today if you genuinely form this intention right now, and the billionaire has perfect knowledge of your mental state and will verify your sincerity. However, there is an important caveat. Once you receive the money and the day passes, you are free to change your mind and not drink the toxin. The money is yours to keep regardless. This is the essence of Kavka's toxin puzzle, a thought experiment that reveals a peculiar gap between rational intention and rational action. On the surface, the puzzle seems to present an easy path to wealth. Form the intention, collect the money, then simply decline to drink the toxin when the moment arrives. Yet something troubling emerges when we examine this more carefully. To genuinely intend to do something means to commit yourself psychologically to actually doing it, not merely to pretend or to go through the motions. Your intention must be authentic and sincere, something the billionaire can detect with certainty. This creates a paradox of rationality itself. It seems rational to form an intention you know you will later abandon because you gain money while suffering nothing. But true rationality demands that your intentions align with your actual future behavior, and it seems irrational to intend to poison yourself when you have every reason to abandon that intention once the financial incentive has been received. The puzzle exposes how intention occupies a strange middle ground between present decision and future action, and how our minds struggle with commitments we know we will later reject. We find ourselves trapped in a logical loop where the very thing that makes success possible, sincere intention, becomes impossible to manufacture once we understand the full consequences of our reasoning. This paradox mirrors real-life dilemmas where we struggle to commit to difficult but beneficial actions, quitting smoking, enduring painful medical treatments, or sustaining unpopular moral stances, precisely because our rational minds recognize that future circumstances may tempt us to abandon our resolve. The puzzle ultimately suggests that perfect rationality may be self-defeating in situations where our future selves have conflicting incentives. Perhaps this is why humans often rely on external commitments, contracts, social pressure, or self-imposed rules to bridge the gap between what we intend and what we actually do, suggesting that our rational nature may require scaffolding from outside ourselves to overcome the paradoxes our own reasoning creates. In this sense, Kavka's toxin puzzle reveals why pure rationality, the ability to coldly calculate costs and benefits, may be insufficient as a guide for human flourishing. We may need to embrace certain irrationalities, like the capacity for genuine commitment even when reason suggests abandonment, to achieve the outcomes we actually value. This insight helps explain why we admire figures who demonstrate unwavering conviction despite personal cost, and why societies develop institutions like oaths, contracts, and legal systems to artificially create the binding commitments that pure reason cannot generate from within itself alone. Consider the moment when you attempt to define something seemingly simple, like what makes a chair, or what constitutes the essence of a melody you love. You begin with confidence, breaking down the object into its component parts, the legs, the seat, the back, yet as you analyze each piece, you realize that removing any single element doesn't necessarily render it no longer a chair, and that conversely, you could assemble these same components in ways that would not constitute a chair at all. The analysis, which you undertook to clarify and illuminate the nature of the thing itself, instead seems to dissolve the very thing you were analyzing, leaving you with nothing but disconnected parts that no longer resemble what you started with. This is the paradox of analysis, one of philosophy's most peculiar and persistent dilemmas about knowledge and definition. When you analyze something into its constituent components to understand what it fundamentally is, the act of analysis itself appears to transform or destroy the unified whole you originally sought to understand, creating a strange epistemological trap where the tool meant to reveal truth instead obscures it. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates through a fundamental tension between the synthetic nature of wholes and the analytic nature of reduction. We believe that understanding means breaking things down into smaller, simpler parts that are easier to comprehend, yet a chair is not merely the sum of its physical components, but also the unified function and form that emerge from their arrangement and relationship. When we reduce a melody to individual notes, we capture the notes but lose the musical experience that makes those notes meaningful. The paradox reveals that some properties exist only at the level of wholes and cannot be captured through analysis of parts alone. Despite recognizing this logical problem for centuries, we continue to operate as if analysis is always the proper method of understanding, normalizing a fundamental mismatch between how we think knowledge works and how knowledge actually functions in relation to complex, unified phenomena. Yet perhaps the deepest irony is that this paradox cannot itself be resolved through analysis, the very method that created it, suggesting that some of our most pressing philosophical puzzles demand a different mode of understanding altogether, one that embraces wholeness rather than reduction. When we contemplate a work of art, a relationship, or even our own sense of self, we encounter the same insurmountable obstacle. The moment we dissect these phenomena to understand them fully, we find ourselves holding only fragments of something that was real and whole only in its undivided form. This recognition invites a humbling question, whether the very act of seeking complete understanding through rational analysis might be fundamentally at odds with the nature of reality itself, and whether wisdom sometimes requires us to accept the limits of what can be known through dissection alone, allowing certain truths to remain whole and experienced rather than explained. Perhaps this is why the most profound human experiences, falling in love, encountering beauty, experiencing grief, resist our attempts to articulate them fully, and why the moment we try to explain them to another person, something essential seems to evaporate, leaving only an approximation of what we felt before we spoke. Consider the peculiar situation that confronts us when we walk through a marketplace on an ordinary afternoon, observing the vast differences in how much people are willing to pay for seemingly similar objects, and how this willingness bears almost no relationship to the actual utility or necessity of the thing being purchased. Water, that most essential substance without which human life cannot persist for more than a few days, costs almost nothing when obtained from a tap or a well. Yet a diamond, a crystallized form of carbon that serves no biological function whatsoever and cannot sustain life in any meaningful way, commands prices that can exceed thousands or even millions of dollars depending on its size and quality. This is the paradox of value, a phenomenon that has puzzled economists and philosophers for centuries, revealing something fundamental about how we assign worth to the objects in our world. The mechanism underlying this contradiction rests upon the concept of marginal utility, which describes how the value we place on something depends not on its total usefulness to humanity, but rather on how much of it is available relative to how much we already possess. Water is abundant, surrounding us constantly and available in quantities far exceeding what we need, and therefore each additional unit of water we obtain provides us with relatively little additional satisfaction or benefit compared to the previous unit we already had. Diamonds, by contrast, are scarce, difficult to extract from the earth, and most people possess none at all, making each diamond extraordinarily valuable in the eyes of those who desire them, not because of any intrinsic superiority in function, but simply because of their rarity and the intensity of demand relative to supply. We have grown so accustomed to this paradoxical way of assigning value that we rarely pause to question it, treating it instead as a natural law of economics, rather than recognizing it as a deeply contingent human construction that depends upon our collective decisions about what matters and why. The paradox persists not because we have failed to understand it, but because we have internalized it so completely that it shapes our behavior at every moment without requiring conscious thought or deliberation. Yet this internalization reveals a deeper truth. Our valuation systems are not merely economic mechanisms, but expressions of our desires, fears, and social hierarchies, such that the price of a diamond ultimately reflects not the stone itself, but the complex web of human psychology, marketing, tradition, and the human capacity to create meaning where none existed before. Consider how a seemingly worthless object, a handwritten letter from a deceased loved one, a photograph from a forgotten era, a stone from a childhood home, can become priceless to its holder, while a flawless gemstone might sit in a vault, generating value only through collective agreement and speculative desire, suggesting that worth is ultimately determined not by objective qualities, but by the stories we tell ourselves and the connections we forge with the material world. This recognition invites us to question not just the prices we pay, but the very foundations of our economic systems, which rest upon the assumption that value can be measured and compared, when in truth it remains eternally subjective, personal, and resistant to any universal formula that might reduce the infinite variety of human desire to a single. Imagine a small town where there exists a single barber, and this barber has established a straightforward rule for his profession. He shaves all those, and only those, who do not shave themselves. This rule seems perfectly reasonable on its surface, a practical arrangement that defines his clientele and ensures his business remains viable within the community. The barber shaves the men who cannot shave themselves or who prefer professional assistance, while those who are capable of shaving themselves handle their own grooming needs, thus keeping the barber's schedule manageable and his services clearly defined. However, when we examine this situation more closely and ask a seemingly innocent question, who shaves the barber himself, we find ourselves trapped in a logical impossibility that has no resolution. If the barber shaves himself, then according to his own rule, he should not be shaved by the barber, which means he should not shave himself, creating an immediate contradiction. Conversely, if the barber does not shave himself, then according to his rule, he should be shaved by the barber, which means he must shave himself, another contradiction. This paradox emerges because the barber's rule attempts to create a clean logical category that is actually self-referential and therefore unstable. The fundamental mechanism at work here involves a set that attempts to contain itself while simultaneously excluding itself, a situation that violates the basic principles of set theory and formal logic. When we try to apply universal rules to the very entity that creates those rules, we discover that language and logic can construct situations where consistency becomes impossible. This paradox has persisted through centuries of philosophical discussion, not because it describes anything truly mysterious about reality, but because it reveals something profound about the limitations of self-referential systems and the careful boundaries we must maintain when creating rules that govern groups of things. It demonstrates that not every logically constructed scenario can exist in reality, and that certain definitions, no matter how clearly stated, can lead us into conceptual dead ends where no action resolves the contradiction. The Barber paradox thus serves as a gateway to understanding deeper logical problems, such as Russell's paradox, which demonstrated that even the foundations of mathematics itself contain similar contradictions when sets are allowed to reference themselves without restriction. By recognizing where our logical systems break down, we gain insight into how to construct better systems that avoid these pitfalls altogether. Modern mathematics resolved this issue by establishing the axiom of foundation, which prevents sets from containing themselves and thus eliminates self-referential contradictions at their source. This foundational principle, though abstract, has profound practical implications. It ensures that the logical systems we rely upon for everything from computer science to engineering are internally consistent and trustworthy. By understanding the Barber paradox and its resolution, we come to appreciate that the most rigorous logical frameworks are not arbitrary restrictions, but necessary safeguards that prevent our reasoning from collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Imagine a judge who announces to a condemned prisoner that they will be executed by hanging sometime during the following week, but the execution will be a complete surprise. The prisoner will not know which day it will occur until the morning of the execution itself. The prisoner, being logical, begins to reason through this puzzle with careful deliberation. If the execution has not occurred by Friday, then it must happen on Saturday, the prisoner thinks, which means it would no longer be a surprise. Therefore, Saturday is impossible. But if Saturday is ruled out, then the latest the execution could occur is Friday, which means if the prisoner reaches Friday morning without execution, they would know it must happen that day, eliminating the surprise element. Through this same logical chain, the prisoner eliminates Thursday, then Wednesday, then Tuesday, and finally Monday, concluding that no day allows for a genuine surprise execution. The prisoner becomes convinced they cannot be executed at all. Yet on Wednesday morning, completely unexpected, the executioner arrives, and the execution proceeds exactly as the judge promised. The prisoner's logical reasoning has been defeated by the paradox's structure, revealing a profound contradiction between the nature of knowledge, certainty, and surprise. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests on a subtle distinction between objective facts and subjective knowledge, between what is true about the world and what the prisoner can know to be true with certainty. The prisoner's reasoning assumes that if they can logically deduce which day the execution must occur, then it would fail to be surprising. But this overlooks the possibility that logical deduction about future events and the actual experience of surprise operate in different domains of understanding. The paradox persists because it exposes how our confidence in pure rationality can be undermined by the performative nature of knowledge itself. The very act of trying to know something in advance can paradoxically prevent that knowing from occurring in the way we anticipated. When the prisoner realizes on Wednesday morning that they were wrong, they confront the unsettling truth that certainty about the future is not the same as control over it. Their flawless logic could not prevent the surprise, only delay their recognition of it. This reveals why the paradox remains genuinely troubling. It suggests that some forms of knowledge may be inherently self-defeating, and that the most rational mind cannot escape the fundamental asymmetry between knowing about an event and experiencing it unfold. The paradox thus becomes a mirror held up to the limits of rationality itself. No amount of logical analysis can dissolve the gap between prediction and lived experience, between what we can deduce must happen and the genuine shock of its happening. In this way, the unexpected hanging paradox reveals that our minds are not omniscient calculators, but temporal beings always embedded within the very uncertainty we attempt to escape through reason. We might say the same about the surprise party we dread or the unexpected gift we receive despite our best efforts to predict it. The future retains a kind of opacity that no amount of prior reasoning can fully penetrate, reminding us that genuine surprise requires not merely ignorance, but a particular kind of cognitive blindness that even our most rigorous logic cannot prevent. Imagine you are standing at one end of a room and you wish to walk to the opposite wall, a distance of perhaps 30 feet before you. Before you can reach that wall, the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea would have you consider something rather troubling about the very nature of motion itself. You must first traverse half the distance, covering 15 feet, and you must do this before you can cover the remaining 15 feet to your destination. But here is where the paradox begins to unfold with relentless logic. Before you can cover that first 15 feet, you must cover half of that distance, which is 7.5 feet. And before you traverse those 7.5 feet, you must cover half of that distance. And before that half, you must cover half of that distance again. And this division continues infinitely, branching backward into smaller and smaller increments that never quite reach zero, but approach it asymptotically. According to this reasoning, you must complete an infinite number of movements before you can even take your first step, which seems logically impossible, yet you know from direct experience that you can and do walk across rooms without any apparent difficulty whatsoever. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests upon a fundamental confusion about the nature of infinity and how infinite sequences can actually sum to finite values. Our intuition rebels against the idea that infinite steps can be completed in finite time, because our everyday experience with finite numbers suggests that infinite quantities should require infinite effort or duration. The paradox exploits a gap between our naive understanding of motion and the mathematical reality that an infinite series of decreasing terms can converge to a definite sum, meaning that walking across a room involves completing infinitely many smaller journeys that together amount to a traversable distance. What makes this paradox persist in human consciousness, despite its logical resolution, is that it captures something genuinely unsettling about the relationship between the continuous and the discrete, between the infinite divisibility of space and the finite reality of accomplished motion. We have normalized this paradox by accepting the mathematical resolution without fully integrating it into our intuitive sense of how the world works, creating a strange cognitive dissonance where we simultaneously believe both that motion is possible and that the argument seems persuasive. This tension between mathematical proof and phenomenological experience reveals why Zeno's paradox has survived more than 2 millennia of refutation. It addresses not a flaw in logic, but a genuine mystery about how consciousness perceives the infinite divisibility of reality, a mystery that persists even after we have solved the mathematical problem. Perhaps this is why we remain haunted by Zeno's vision even in an age of calculus and physics, because it forces us to confront the possibility that our lived experience of the world may rest on assumptions about continuity and motion that are fundamentally different from how reality actually operates at its deepest levels, a gap that no mathematical proof can entirely close. And yet, in those moments when we pause mid-stride to contemplate the infinite steps beneath our feet, we glimpse something profound, that the very act of walking is itself a kind of faith, a willingness to move forward despite the logical vertigo that arises when we scrut. Imagine a nation where every household, fearing economic uncertainty, decides to increase their savings and reduce their spending in order to build financial security for themselves and their families. On the surface, this seems like a reasonable and prudent response to anxiety about the future, a rational choice made by individuals who wish to protect themselves from hardship and ensure their own well-being. Yet when this behavior spreads across an entire economy, something unexpected and counterintuitive begins to happen. As people spend less money, businesses see their revenues decline because they have fewer customers purchasing their goods and services. With reduced revenues, companies must lay off workers to cut costs, which increases unemployment and further reduces consumer spending, creating a vicious cycle that spirals downward. The very act of saving, which seems individually sensible and financially responsible, inadvertently weakens the broader economy in ways that ultimately harm the savers themselves by reducing employment opportunities, lowering incomes, and potentially triggering the very recession they were trying to protect themselves against. This is the paradox of thrift, a phenomenon first articulated clearly by economist John Maynard Keynes, who recognized that what appears rational for an individual becomes destructive when multiplied across millions of people making similar choices simultaneously. The mechanism behind this paradox reveals a fundamental tension between individual rationality and collective outcomes, where the sum of individually logical decisions produces a collectively irrational and harmful. What makes this paradox particularly interesting is that despite our understanding of it, economies continue to experience these cycles of panic-induced saving that trigger recessions, suggesting that fear and uncertainty override our knowledge of economic consequences, and that the appeal of personal financial security remains more psychologically powerful than abstract warnings about macroeconomic effects that feel distant and impersonal to ordinary people managing their household finances. This dynamic also explains why government stimulus during recessions often focuses on encouraging spending rather than saving. Policymakers must actively work against the natural instinct to hoard resources in order to break the cycle and restore the flow of money through the economy, even though this runs counter to the personal financial advice individuals receive in their daily lives. Yet this tension between personal prudence and collective welfare remains largely unresolved in how societies communicate economic policy to their citizens, leaving individuals caught between the contradictory advice to save responsibly for their own future while simultaneously being asked to spend for the health of the broader economy, a paradox that extends far beyond economics into the fundamental question of how individual and collective interests can ever truly align. Perhaps the deepest insight is that the paradox of thrift forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. In an interconnected economy, pure self-interest divorced from collective consideration becomes self-defeating, and genuine security can only be achieved when enough individuals trust others enough to keep spending and investing in shared prosperity rather than retreating into defensive isolation. Imagine a society faced with a decision about how to allocate resources between education, healthcare, and infrastructure, and the citizens must somehow combine their individual preferences into a single collective choice that represents the will of the group. Yet no matter what voting system or decision-making process they employ, something seems to go fundamentally wrong with the outcome. This is the territory of Arrow's impossibility theorem, a mathematical discovery that reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of democratic decision-making and preference aggregation. Kenneth Arrow, an economist working in the 1950s, proved that it is mathematically impossible to design a voting system or preference-combining mechanism that simultaneously satisfies a small set of seemingly reasonable and desirable criteria. The first criterion, called unrestricted domain, requires that the system must be able to handle any possible configuration of individual preferences without restriction. The second criterion, called non-dictatorship, insists that no single person should have absolute power to determine the collective outcome regardless of what others prefer. The third criterion, called independence of irrelevant alternatives, states that the collective ranking of any two options should depend only on how individuals rank those two options relative to each other, not on how they feel about other alternatives. Finally, the Pareto efficiency condition requires that if every single person prefers option A to option B, then the collective preference must also rank above B. These criteria seem entirely reasonable and non-controversial on their surface. Yet Arrow's proof demonstrates that no system can satisfy all four criteria simultaneously, meaning that every real-world voting mechanism must fail at least one of them. This paradox persists in our democratic systems precisely because we have come to accept the inevitable compromises, developing an almost resigned sophistication about the flaws in how we translate individual desires into collective action, treating the imperfection as an unfortunate but unavoidable feature of group decision-making rather than wrestling with the deeper implications of its logical impossibility. Yet this resignation may itself be the theorem's most profound insight. By proving that perfection is mathematically forbidden, Arrow liberated us from the impossible pursuit of an ideal voting system, redirecting our efforts instead toward understanding which imperfection we find most tolerable and why different societies make such different choices about which of democracy's foundational ideals to sacrifice. Some societies prioritize the will of the majority even when it steamrolls minorities, while others engineer systems that protect minority interests at the cost of pure majoritarianism, and still others accept strategic voting and agenda manipulation as the price of stability, each choice revealing not a failure of democracy, but rather a statement about what that society believes a good society should fundamentally be. The theorem thus becomes not a verdict of failure but a mirror held up to our values, forcing us to ask whether we truly believe in absolute majority rule, or whether we cherish the protection of dissenting voices more than the purity of democratic aggregation. And in answering that question, we inadvertently define the very character of our civilization. Imagine a group of three voters who must choose between three candidates, Alice, Bob, and Carol. The first voter prefers Alice over Bob and Bob over Carol, creating a clear ranking of Alice, then Bob, then Carol. The second voter has a different preference order, ranking Bob ahead of Carol and Carol ahead of Alice. The third voter completes the picture by preferring Carol to Alice and Alice to Bob. Now when we ask these voters to decide through pairwise comparisons, something peculiar emerges that seems to defy rational expectation. When Alice and Bob are compared, two voters prefer Alice, so Alice wins that matchup. When Bob and Carol are compared, two voters prefer Bob, suggesting Bob should advance. Yet when we compare Alice and Carol directly, two voters actually prefer Carol, which would eliminate Alice entirely. This creates a circular preference where Alice beats Bob, Bob beats Carol, but Carol beats Alice, forming an impossible cycle that violates the fundamental logic of transitivity that we expect from rational choice. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests on a simple mathematical truth. Individual preferences that are perfectly rational and internally consistent can combine through democratic voting procedures to produce collective preferences that are completely irrational and cyclical. Each individual voter maintains a transitive preference order, meaning their choices never contradict themselves, yet the aggregation of these separate rational orderings produces a group preference that contradicts itself fundamentally. The paradox persists in real democratic systems despite its logical impossibility, because we rarely engage in explicit pairwise comparisons of every option. Instead, we use voting systems that collapse multiple choices into single outcomes, systems that inevitably lose information and create winners through procedural accident rather than genuine collective preference. We have normalized this strange outcome by simply accepting that democratic voting produces winners without asking whether those winners genuinely reflect what the group actually prefers. The implications cut deeper when we consider that the winner produced by any voting method is partly an artifact of the procedure itself. Change the voting system, and you may change the outcome, even though the underlying preferences remain identical. This suggests that our democratic results are not merely imperfect reflections of the people's will, but are substantially constructed by the mechanical rules we choose to govern the choice itself. This recognition transforms democracy from a neutral truth discovery mechanism into something more akin to an art form, where the skillful architect of voting rules can predictably shape outcomes, a troubling realization that invites us to reconsider whether any voting system can truly be called fair, or whether fairness itself is merely a comforting fiction we tell ourselves about inherently ambiguous collective choices. Perhaps this explains why political theorists have long recognized that the true power in democratic systems often lies not with voters themselves, but with those who control the agenda, who decides which candidates appear on the ballot, in what order, and through which procedural steps, because these architectural choices can determine outcomes as surely as the votes themselves. Imagine a scenario where millions of people participate in an election, each individual casting a single vote with the hope that their choice will determine the outcome of the race. And yet the probability that any one person's vote will actually change the final result is vanishingly small, often infinitesimally close to zero. And this mathematical reality seems to suggest that voting is fundamentally irrational because the cost of voting, the time spent waiting in line, the effort required to travel to a polling place, the mental energy devoted to researching candidates, vastly outweighs the expected benefit of casting a vote that almost certainly will not swing the election in any meaningful way. The voting paradox emerges from this tension between the apparent logic of individual rational choice and the widespread belief that voting is a moral and civic duty that citizens ought to fulfill regardless of these mathematical probabilities. When we examine this phenomenon more closely, we discover that the paradox reveals something profound about how human beings actually make decisions and how we reconcile ourselves to the limitations of our individual agency within larger systems. People continue to vote despite knowing, at least intuitively, that their single vote carries minimal instrumental value because voting operates on multiple psychological and philosophical levels simultaneously. The act of voting serves not merely as an attempt to influence a specific election outcome, but rather as a ritual affirmation of one's participation in a democratic system, an expression of identity and values, a gesture of solidarity with others who share similar political beliefs, and a way of maintaining the social contract that depends on collective participation to remain legitimate. Furthermore, the paradox persists because each citizen makes a similar calculation, that if everyone reasoned this way and refused to vote because their individual contributions seemed negligible, the entire system would collapse, which creates a kind of collective action problem where the rational individual choice and the rational collective choice point in opposite directions. What makes this paradox particularly fascinating is that democracies around the world continue to function, because millions of people choose to vote despite its apparent irrationality when viewed through a purely instrumental lens, suggesting that humans operate according to a moral logic that transcends simple cost-benefit analysis, and that we intuitively understand the necessity of participating in systems larger than ourselves. In this way, the voting paradox ultimately dissolves not through mathematical reasoning, but through the recognition that human rationality encompasses dimensions beyond mere probability and self-interest. We vote because we understand ourselves as participants in something transcendent, a shared experiment in collective self-governance that cannot survive if enough individuals reduce their citizenship to a calculation of personal advantage. The paradox thus becomes a window into understanding how societies persist through the voluntary commitment of individuals who choose meaning and duty over narrow self-interest, transforming what appears as mathematical irrationality into perhaps the most rational decision a citizen can make. Imagine a massive state lottery where millions of people purchase tickets, each person holding a slip of paper with a number printed upon it, a number among hundreds of millions of possibilities. Yet despite the overwhelming odds against their individual ticket being selected as the winner, nearly every single participant believes with genuine conviction that their ticket will not win. Consider the mathematical reality. If there are 10 million tickets sold and only one winner, the probability that any single ticket will lose is approximately 9,999,999 divided by 10 million, a ratio so overwhelmingly close to absolute certainty that it becomes reasonable to believe that your particular ticket will not be the chosen one. This reasoning applies equally to every other ticket holder in the lottery, and indeed it would be rational for each person to hold this belief about their own ticket. Yet here lies the paradox. If it is rational for each individual person to believe that their own ticket will lose, then it must be rational for everyone to believe that everyone's ticket will lose, which would mean it is rational to believe that no one will win the lottery at all, a conclusion that is logically impossible since someone must win. The psychological mechanism at work involves our natural ability to apply probabilistic reasoning to our own circumstances, while simultaneously understanding that probability must distribute itself across all participants. Yet we find ourselves unable to reconcile these two perspectives into a coherent whole. We maintain the rational belief that our ticket will lose while simultaneously acknowledging that the lottery must produce a winner from among all the tickets. And we do this not because we have solved the logical tension, but rather because we have learned to compartmentalize these contradictory convictions in our minds. This paradox persists in human thought not because we have failed to notice it, or because we lack the intellectual capacity to understand it, but rather because the practical necessities of living in a world governed by probability require us to hold multiple conflicting beliefs simultaneously, and we have simply accepted this rational discomfort as an ordinary feature of how we navigate uncertainty and chance. The same mechanism appears in countless other domains. We rationally believe we will not be struck by lightning, contract a rare disease, or experience a catastrophic accident, yet we acknowledge that these events regularly befall someone somewhere, and we structure our insurance policies and safety precautions around this uncomfortable duality, effectively betting against ourselves while simultaneously betting with the aggregate. Perhaps the deepest insight is that this paradox reveals the lottery itself as a perfect metaphor for human existence. We each rationally expect to avoid tragedy, yet we collectively know that tragedy will visit someone, and we proceed through life sustained by this necessary illusion, understanding that our individual exemption from harm is statistically improbable even as we cannot help but believe in it. This paradox ultimately reveals that rationality itself contains hidden compartments. We are not creatures of pure logic, but beings who must live within the gaps between statistical truth and personal narrative, between what we know about the world and what we must believe about ourselves to survive it. Consider the common experience of reading a book's preface, introduction, or foreword, and you will encounter a peculiar logical tension that has troubled readers and writers for centuries. The author stands before you, the reader, claiming that what you are about to read is either incomplete, flawed, rushed, poorly organized, written under difficult circumstances, or in some way unworthy of your full attention and critical engagement. Yet simultaneously, this same author has chosen to publish this work, to bind it into pages, to distribute it into the world, and to ask you to invest your time and money in consuming it. The preface becomes a strange confession of inadequacy delivered by someone asking you to believe in their competence. Writers find themselves in an impossible position where they must simultaneously argue that their work is worth reading while also warning you that it might not be. They apologize for limitations in scope, acknowledge gaps in their research, explain the constraints under which they labored, and invite you to forgive them for falling short of their own ideals. This creates a paradox at the threshold of the text itself. If the work is truly as flawed as the preface suggests, why should anyone proceed beyond that opening statement? Yet if the work is actually sound and worthy, why does the author feel compelled to undermine it with such apologetic language? The mechanism beneath this paradox involves several psychological and social factors working in tension. Authors often use the preface to appear humble, self-aware, and intellectually honest, believing that acknowledging limitations will somehow grant them credibility and forgiveness in advance. They hope that by preemptively criticizing their own work, they inoculate themselves against criticism from others. Additionally, there exists a cultural expectation that serious authors must display uncertainty, must avoid seeming arrogant or overconfident, and must position themselves as always striving toward an ideal they can never quite reach. The preface has become a ritualized space where authors perform intellectual modesty. Yet this convention persists despite its fundamental illogic, and we have normalized this strange contradiction so thoroughly that it barely registers as unusual. We have learned to read prefaces as a separate category of writing, one where different rules apply, where disclaimers do not actually diminish our expectation of the work itself. We have created an unspoken agreement to ignore the paradox, to acknowledge the author's doubts and then proceed as though they were never expressed at all. This collective willingness to suspend disbelief mirrors how we navigate other social conventions. We accept the fiction because the alternative, taking everything literally, would paralyze human communication. Perhaps the preface paradox ultimately reveals not a flaw in logic, but rather our sophisticated ability to hold contradictory meanings in mind simultaneously, understanding that an author's self-doubt and their work's value need not cancel each other out. We might even say that this capacity for cognitive flexibility is itself what makes intellectual progress possible. A scholar can doubt their own conclusions while still publishing them, knowing that their work will be tested, refined, and built upon by others who hold similar doubts alongside equal conviction. Imagine a person who holds a particular belief about the world, perhaps that people of a certain background are inherently untrustworthy, or that a specific political ideology is fundamentally corrupt, or that a dietary practice will cure almost any ailment. This person encounters countless interactions and information throughout their daily life, a vast river of experiences and data flowing past them constantly. When they encounter evidence that aligns with their existing belief, they notice it vividly, they remember it clearly, they share it readily with others, and they feel a quiet sense of validation that their understanding of the world is correct. However, when they encounter information that contradicts their belief, something peculiar happens in their mind. They scrutinize it more harshly, they find reasons to doubt its source or methodology, they explain it away as an exception or a special case, or they simply forget about it entirely, allowing it to pass through their consciousness without leaving a lasting impression. This selective attention and memory creates a feedback loop, where their original belief becomes progressively more entrenched and seemingly more validated by experience, even though they are filtering reality through the lens of what they already believe to be true. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through what psychologists call confirmation bias, a cognitive tendency so fundamental to human thought that it persists even when people are explicitly made aware of it. Our brains are not neutral processors of information, but rather active interpreters that work to maintain coherence between our beliefs and our observations. When we encounter new information, we unconsciously ask ourselves whether it supports what we already think we know, and this question shapes how we process, evaluate, and store that information. The paradox emerges because the more we seek confirmation, the more confirmation we seem to find, which makes us more confident in our original belief, which makes us more likely to seek further confirmation in exactly the same biased way. It is a self-perpetuating cycle that creates the illusion of an increasingly accurate understanding of reality while actually moving us further from objective truth. What makes this paradox particularly persistent and difficult to escape is that it operates largely outside conscious awareness, and even when we recognize it intellectually, we remain vulnerable to its pull. We have evolved to be belief-maintaining creatures rather than belief-revising creatures because, for most of human history, consistency and confidence in our worldview provided survival advantages, allowing us to act decisively even with incomplete information. This ancient mechanism continues to influence our thinking in the modern world, where information is abundant and where the stakes of our beliefs often feel personal and identity-based rather than merely practical. We have normalized the paradox of confirmation so thoroughly that we rarely notice ourselves engaging in it, and we interpret the world's apparent validation of our beliefs not as evidence of our bias, but as evidence of our wisdom and perception. The tragedy deepens when we consider that the people most trapped in confirmation bias are often the most convinced of their objectivity, mistaking the coherence of their filtered worldview for evidence of clear thinking, while those who genuinely question their own belief. Imagine you are observing the color of emeralds throughout history, and a philosopher named Nelson Goodman asks you to consider a peculiar property he calls grue, which means that something is green if it has been observed before the year 2001, and blue if it has not been observed before that arbitrary date, and then imagine that all emeralds you have ever examined have appeared green, which is entirely consistent with the grue hypothesis since they were all observed before the specified temporal boundary, and yet we find ourselves confident that future emeralds will also be green rather than blue, though the grue hypothesis predicts with equal logical validity that they should turn blue once we cross into the 21st century and beyond. This is the paradox that troubles our intuitions about induction and the nature of confirmation. For both the standard hypothesis that emeralds are simply and eternally green and the eccentric grue hypothesis are supported equally well by all available evidence, and yet we dismiss one as absurd while embracing the other as obviously true. The mechanism underlying this puzzle reveals something fundamental about how our minds categorize properties and project patterns into the future. As we unconsciously privilege certain predicates over others, treating green as a natural and projectable property while regarding gru as a contrived and artificial construction, though Goodman argues that this distinction cannot be justified by logic alone and instead must rest on our habits of language and thought. We have normalized this selective confidence in certain inductions over others by simply refusing to acknowledge that our choice between competing hypotheses lacks an objective logical foundation, instead allowing custom and conceptual convenience to masquerade as rational necessity, and we continue to make predictions about the world based on patterns we have observed, assuming that our past observations reliably indicate future occurrences. Despite the fact that infinitely many logically consistent alternative hypotheses could explain those same observations if we were willing to entertain sufficiently unusual property definitions. Yet this problem extends beyond emeralds and colors. Whenever we observe that bread has nourished us in the past, we assume it will continue to do so tomorrow, but a GRU-like predicate could just as easily describe a property that nourishes only before some future date, forcing us to confront the unsettling possibility that our most basic inductive inferences rest not on logic, but on the largely arbitrary linguistic conventions we have inherited and internalized without scrutiny. And perhaps most troublingly, Goodman suggests that there is no principled way to declare one set of linguistic conventions more natural than another, meaning that our confidence in induction may ultimately reduce to nothing more than the accident of which predicates our ancestors happen to favor, a realization that should make us humble about the certainty we invest in our predictions about everything from scientific laws to the reliability of our closest relationships. Yet perhaps this humbling recognition need not lead to radical skepticism. Instead, it might encourage us to acknowledge that induction works not because it corresponds to some objective logical truth, but because we collectively agree to project certain patterns forward, and this shared commitment to particular PR. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of darkness, perhaps in a cave or forest as twilight descends, and you notice something peculiar about the way your perception shifts as light diminishes. The GRU paradox emerges from this everyday experience of transitional vision, a logical puzzle that challenges our fundamental understanding of how properties change and at what point something becomes fundamentally different from what it was before. Consider a color spectrum moving from bright yellow through orange, red, and gradually into darkness itself, and ask yourself the seemingly simple question: at what exact moment does a color cease to be that color and become something else entirely, something we might call black or darkness? This paradox takes its name from the fictional creature called a GRU, a monster from interactive fiction that could only be perceived once complete darkness fell. Yet before that transition occurred, the GRU existed in the same space, in the same moment, neither visible nor invisible, but somewhere suspended between these two states. The logical mechanism behind this paradox operates through what philosophers call the Sorites problem or the paradox of the heap, where incremental changes that seem individually negligible accumulate into categorical transformations that feel sudden and absolute. When we remove a single grain of sand from a heap, the heap remains a heap, and this continues to feel true even after countless individual removals. Yet eventually we arrive at something that is clearly not a heap at all, and we cannot identify the precise removal where the transformation occurred. Similarly, with light and visibility, we cannot mark the exact photon where an object transitions from visible to invisible, from graspable to mysterious, yet we accept intuitively that such a transition has taken place. This paradox persists in our thinking because language and categorization demand sharp boundaries even when nature provides us only with gradual transitions, and we have simply accepted this fundamental mismatch between the continuous nature of physical reality and the discrete nature of our conceptual categories without fully resolving the tension at their intersection. The GRU paradox thus reveals that our most confident distinctions between light and dark, visible and hidden, known and unknown, rest upon conventions we have adopted rather than discoveries we have made, suggesting that reality itself may be far more ambiguous than our need for clarity allows us to admit. Yet perhaps this ambiguity is not a flaw in our thinking, but a feature of existence itself, a reminder that the universe does not organize itself according to our categorical convenience, and that wisdom might lie in embracing the twilight spaces where our certainties dissolve rather than insisting that such spaces must resolve into one clear state or another. When we accept the grue and the darkness, the thing we cannot quite see or name, we begin to recognize that many of life's most significant experiences exist in precisely these liminal zones. The moment a relationship shifts from friendship to love, the point at which grief transforms into acceptance, or the threshold where a person becomes someone we no longer recognize, and perhaps our inability to pinpoint these transitions is not a logical failure, but an invitation to hold multiple truths simultaneously, to dwell comfortably in uncertainty rather than demand the false clarity that categorical thinking. Consider the curious asymmetry that computer scientist Hans Moravec observed in the 1980s when he began experimenting with artificial intelligence and robotics. Noticing that machines could perform feats of abstract reasoning and calculation that would astound human mathematicians, yet struggled profoundly with tasks that any 5-year-old child could accomplish without conscious effort, such as walking across uneven ground, recognizing a face in a crowded room, or grasping an object with appropriate pressure. A computer could defeat a chess grandmaster in minutes, calculating millions of positions within human speed, yet the same machine could not reliably pour water into a cup or navigate a cluttered living room without becoming hopelessly confused by the infinite variability of the real world. This inversion of difficulty, where the supposedly intelligent tasks prove simple and the supposedly simple tasks prove impossibly complex, reveals something profound about the nature of intelligence itself and the assumptions we have built into our understanding of what constitutes difficulty. The explanation lies in the evolutionary timeline of human cognition, for abstract reasoning and symbolic manipulation are relatively recent acquisitions in the grand scheme of human development, appearing only within the last few 100,000 years, whereas the sensory-motor skills of movement, perception, and object manipulation have been refined over millions of years through countless generations of survival pressures that demanded increasingly sophisticated interaction with a complex physical environment. Our brains are optimized at the deepest levels for these ancient tasks, processing visual information and coordinating movement through neural systems that operate largely beneath conscious awareness, making these activities feel effortless and automatic to us, while mathematics and chess are novel challenges that require conscious deliberation and explicit rule following. Artificial intelligence systems, by contrast, are built from the ground up around symbolic processing and logical operations, making them naturally adept at formal systems but requiring enormous effort to replicate the intuitive, embodied knowledge that humans take for granted. Yet despite understanding this paradox for decades, we continue to be surprised by it, continuing to build machines that are brilliant calculators but clumsy movers, continuing to assume that intelligence scales uniformly, and continuing to underestimate the complexity of what our bodies and instincts accomplish every moment we are awake in the world. This humbling recognition invites us to reconsider what we mean by intelligence itself. Perhaps it is not a single faculty that scales uniformly from simple to complex, but rather a collection of distinct capabilities that evolution has weighted according to survival value, suggesting that a truly intelligent machine might need to be embodied in the world, learning through interaction rather than through pure computation alone. Such machines might learn that grasping requires not just the geometry of fingers and objects, but an understanding of material properties, weight distribution, and the subtle feedback loops between sensation and motor control, knowledge that emerges not from equations alone, but from the accumulated experience of countless failures and successes in a physical world that refuses to be fully formalized. Imagine an artificial intelligence tasked with a simple objective: move a table out of a room to retrieve a key underneath it. The robot perceives the table, understands the goal, and begins to formulate a plan. It decides to push the table aside, which will accomplish the task. However, as it calculates the consequences of moving the table, it must account for countless details. If the table moves, what happens to the objects on top of it? If those objects fall, do they break? If they break, how does that affect the room's temperature? If the temperature changes, does that affect the key's molecular structure? Does the key still function if its atomic composition has theoretically shifted due to thermal variations? The robot finds itself spiraling into an infinite cascade of potential consequences, each one seemingly relevant, each one demanding calculation. This is the frame problem, and it reveals something profound about the nature of reasoning itself. When we humans face a decision, We perform a remarkable feat of filtering without even noticing we are doing it. We inherently know which details matter and which ones do not. We understand, without explicit instruction, that moving a table does not require us to recalculate the physics of distant galaxies or consider whether the furniture's color will affect quantum entanglement. Our minds naturally frame problems within appropriate boundaries, focusing on relevant variables while dismissing the irrelevant ones. Yet this seemingly simple ability has proven extraordinarily difficult to replicate in artificial systems. The frame problem emerged as a genuine philosophical puzzle in the 1970s when researchers realized that artificial intelligence could not easily distinguish between what matters and what does not in any given situation. Despite decades of advancement in machine learning and reasoning systems, the fundamental challenge persists in subtle ways. We have become so accustomed to our own framing abilities that we rarely acknowledge how much of our intelligence depends on this invisible skill, this capacity to automatically determine what belongs inside the frame of a problem and what lies safely outside it. When a child learns that pushing a toy across the floor won't alter the orbits of planets, they are implicitly solving the frame problem, drawing boundaries around relevant causes and effects. This same intuitive framing, refined through evolution and experience, remains one of artificial intelligence's most elusive targets, a reminder that human reasoning contains depths we have yet to fully understand. Perhaps this is why the most sophisticated AI systems still require human oversight, not because they lack computational power, but because they lack this intuitive sense of proportion, this wisdom about what truly deserves our attention and what we can safely ignore. The irony is that this wisdom, knowing what to ignore, may be more valuable than raw intelligence itself. In a world of infinite information and competing demands, the ability to frame problems correctly has become the true bottleneck of progress, separating those who solve meaningful problems from those lost in algorithmic noise. Perhaps this is why artists and philosophers, not just engineers, will be essential to building better AI. They understand intuitively how to compose a scene, knowing which elements to emphasize and which to render invisible, a skill that mirrors the very framing problem machines still STR. Consider the moment when a child first learns the word tree by pointing at an actual tree, feeling its bark, seeing its leaves move in the wind, understanding through direct sensory experience what this particular thing is, and then later encountering the written symbol TRE on a page or screen, a mere arrangement of marks that somehow refers back to that original experience, that tangible object in the world. The symbol grounding problem asks us to contemplate how abstract marks, sounds, and signs acquire meaning in the first place, and whether meaning can truly exist independent of some connection to the physical world or to our lived experience within it. The philosophical puzzle centers on a seemingly simple question: what gives a symbol its meaning? When you read the word love, your mind immediately grasps a complex emotional experience, but the symbol itself is just ink or pixels arranged in a particular pattern, and there is no inherent connection between that pattern and the felt sensation of love itself. We seem to derive meaning through chains of other symbols, defining words using other words in an endless circle, yet somewhere along that chain there must be a point where a symbol connects to something real, something experienced directly rather than symbolically understood. The problem deepens when we consider whether artificial intelligence or computers can ever truly understand language if they only manipulate symbols without ever experiencing what those symbols represent. A machine might process the word pain and respond appropriately, following rules and patterns, but does it understand pain as humans do through the visceral knowledge of suffering? This puzzle reveals a fundamental tension in how meaning works in our minds and in our systems of communication, suggesting that perhaps meaning cannot be purely abstract or purely physical, but must involve some bridging relationship between the symbolic and the sensory, between what we think and what we experience in the world around us. Whether this bridging relationship is purely biological, rooted in our embodied interactions with the world, or whether it might be artificially constructed through sufficiently rich patterns of interaction, remains one of the deepest open questions in cognitive science and philosophy of mind. Some argue that grounding emerges not from isolated symbols but from their dense interconnection, that tree gains meaning not just from touching bark, but from its web of relations to roots, photosynthesis, seasons, shelter, and countless other experiences, while others insist that without at least some foundational sensory anchor, even the richest network of connections remains hollow abstraction. Yet perhaps the deepest insight is that we need not choose between these views. A child learns tree through embodied experience, yes, but that initial grounding only becomes meaningful through its integration into a vast web of conceptual relations, suggesting that meaning emerges from the dynamic interplay between sensation and system, between the singular moment of touching bark and the lifetime of thinking about trees. This dynamic interplay reveals why symbol grounding matters profoundly for understanding minds, both human and artificial, and why a child's first encounter with a tree, far from being a simple labeling exercise, is actually a microcosm of how all understanding emerges from the mysterious fusion of sensation, memory, and conceptual integ. Imagine you are sitting in a quiet room, observing the color red on a painted wall before you, and in that moment, you experience what philosophers call qualia, the subjective, felt quality of that redness as it appears to your consciousness, distinct from any objective description of wavelengths or neural activity. This experiential dimension of consciousness, the so-called hard problem, represents one of the deepest puzzles in philosophy of mind, because while we can explain how the brain processes information and generates behavioral responses to stimuli, we struggle fundamentally to explain why these processes are accompanied by subjective experience at all. The hard problem asks, given that we can theoretically build a complete neurobiological account of vision, explaining every neural mechanism involved in seeing red, why should there be something it feels like to see red? Why is consciousness not merely information processing in the dark, as it were, with no inner light of experience illuminating the process? The mechanism driving this paradox lies in the apparent gap between objective, third-person physical descriptions of brain activity and subjective, first-person phenomenal experience, a divide that philosophers have termed the explanatory gap, and this gap persists because when we examine the neural correlates of consciousness, the specific brain states that accompany conscious experiences, we can describe their structure and function in exhaustive detail without ever touching upon why they should generate the intrinsic, qualitative character of experience itself. We have normalized this conceptual problem by accepting it as simply the current limit of neuroscience, assuming that future discoveries might eventually bridge the explanatory gap through some yet unknown mechanism, or by adopting philosophical positions that deny the problem's validity altogether. Yet the hard problem endures precisely because no amount of functional or structural information about the brain seems capable of logically entailing the existence of subjective experience. Leaving consciousness as perhaps the most intimate and undeniable aspect of our existence, also the most scientifically intractable. Consider that even if we could map every synapse firing as you perceive that red wall, predict your every neural response, we would still face the stubborn fact that none of this explanation addresses the central mystery, why the redness feels the way it does to you, rather than feeling like something else entirely or nothing at all. This is sometimes called the inverted spectrum problem. Two people might have identical neural responses to red light, yet there is no way to verify whether the subjective quality of red in your mind is the same as the subjective quality of red in theirs, or whether your experience of redness might be radically different from everyone else's while remaining functionally identical. The hard problem thus reveals consciousness not merely as a scientific puzzle awaiting solution, but as a fundamental feature of reality that may require us to reconceptualize the very nature of explanation itself. Some philosophers and neuroscientists have proposed radical solutions, panpsychism, which suggests consciousness may be a fundamental feature of matter itself, dualism, which posits mind and brain as separate substances, or functionalism, which argues that consciousness simply is what certain information processing systems do, yet each respo. Consider the moment you observe a red apple sitting on a wooden table in front of you. Your eyes register the color red through one neural pathway, while simultaneously your brain processes the shape through another distinct neural mechanism, and yet another system handles the texture and the spatial location of the object. These different sensory qualities arrive at your brain through completely separate channels and are processed by different regions of your cortex that operate in parallel, each working independently without inherent knowledge of what the others are doing. Yet somehow, mysteriously, your conscious experience binds all these fragmented pieces together into a unified perception of a single apple, complete with its redness, its roundness, and its position on the table before you. This is the binding problem, and it represents one of neuroscience's most perplexing questions about how the brain creates the seamless, integrated reality we experience every waking moment. The paradox deepens when we examine the actual mechanisms at work in your nervous system, for nowhere in the brain exists a central location where all these separate streams of information converge into consciousness. No master control room receives a comprehensive report of all sensory data, analyzed and organized into the cohesive experience you possess. Instead, the brain appears to work through a distributed network of interconnected regions, each contributing fragments of processed information, yet the subjective experience remains unified and whole. The binding problem challenges us to explain how billions of neurons, operating in scattered locations throughout the brain, manage to create this singular, integrated conscious experience from their distributed parallel processing. We have developed numerous theories attempting to resolve this paradox, suggesting that synchronized neural oscillations might bind related information, or that attention itself acts as the binding mechanism, yet none fully explains the complete integration of consciousness. What remains is our persistent acceptance of unified perception as something natural and inevitable, even as the underlying mechanisms that create it from fragmented neural processes remain fundamentally mysterious and perhaps even unknowable through current scientific approaches. Perhaps this mystery endures because consciousness itself may not operate according to the linear, mechanistic principles we apply to other biological systems, suggesting that the binding problem reveals not a gap in our knowledge, but rather a fundamental limitation in how we approach understanding the subjective nature of human experience. Yet when we consider that even artificial systems struggle to replicate this binding capacity despite vast computational power, we confront the possibility that consciousness may require something fundamentally different from our current models of information processing, a quality that cannot be simply engineered or explained, but only experienced. This might explain why the binding problem remains at the intersection of neuroscience, philosophy, and physics, territories where measurement and observation themselves become part of what is being studied, suggesting that some aspects of consciousness may be fundamentally resistant to the third-person, objective methodologies that have served science so well in understanding the physical world. Imagine you are standing in a vast library where each book represents a single atom, and there are more books than there are stars in all observable galaxies combined, yet this library is merely the physical substance of a single grain of sand. Now imagine that these atoms, when combined in particular ways, suddenly give rise to consciousness, to the experience of seeing the color red, to the sensation of tasting chocolate, to the feeling of profound joy or devastating sorrow. This is the essence of the combination problem, a philosophical puzzle that emerges when we attempt to understand how the subjective, qualitative experiences of individual conscious entities can somehow fuse together to create a unified conscious whole. The problem becomes particularly acute when we consider panpsychism, the view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality that exists at all levels, even in elementary particles and atoms. If a single electron possesses some form of primitive experience, however minimal and alien to our own understanding, then how do billions upon billions of these microconscious entities combine to produce the rich, unified stream of consciousness that you experience right now as you hear these words? The mechanism by which this combination supposedly occurs remains mysteriously opaque, for it seems that no amount of adding together simple experiences should logically produce a complex unified experience. Much like adding together many one-dimensional lines should never somehow produce a three-dimensional object without some fundamentally new principle of organization at work. Yet we persist in this view because the alternative seems equally troubling, for denying that electrons and atoms have any form of experience appears to suggest that consciousness somehow magically emerges from purely non-conscious matter, a kind of miraculous leap that seems to violate our intuitions about how the physical world operates. We have normalized this paradox by largely ignoring it, by proceeding with our scientific investigations and our daily lives without ever resolving whether consciousness is truly combinable, or whether our very concept of combination breaks down at some fundamental level when applied to the subjective and qualitative dimensions of experience itself. Perhaps the deepest irony is that consciousness itself, that very faculty we use to contemplate this puzzle, may be fundamentally incapable of grasping how its own existence emerges from the combination of unconscious parts, leaving us forever trapped within the very mystery we seek to unravel. And yet, perhaps this very impossibility hints at something profound, that consciousness might not be a property that combines it all, but rather a fundamental feature of reality that merely expresses itself through different levels of organization and complexity, suggesting that the combination problem dissolves not when we solve it, but when we recognize that we have been asking the wrong question all along. If this reframing is correct, then the very act of asking, how do conscious parts combine, may be as misguided as asking, how does wetness combine? Wetness is not a property that emerges from H2O molecules combining, but rather a description of how water molecules interact at scale, suggesting that consciousness might similarly be an irreducible feature of how complex systems organize themselves, not a puzzle to be solved, but a pattern to be recognized. Imagine a neuroscientist named Mary who has spent her entire life in a black and white room, studying the nature of color through black and white books, monitors, and educational materials, learning everything there is to know about the physical properties of color, the wavelengths of light, the neurological processes that occur when humans perceive red or blue or green, the chemistry of pigments, the physics of reflection and refraction, and yet she has never actually seen color herself. Existing only in her achromatic environment until one day the door opens and she steps out into the world and sees a red rose for the first time, and the question emerges. Has Mary learned something new, something she did not know before despite her exhaustive theoretical knowledge? And if so, what does this tell us about the nature of knowledge itself and the limits of physical understanding? This thought experiment, known as the knowledge argument or Mary's room, presents us with a profound paradox about the relationship between objective facts and subjective experience, between what philosophers call propositional knowledge and experiential knowledge, between knowing about something and knowing what something is like. The mechanism underlying this paradox rests on a fundamental gap in human understanding, the apparent impossibility of completely capturing qualitative experience through purely physical description, no matter how detailed or comprehensive that physical description might be, because the subjective quality of seeing red, what philosophers term qualia, seems to possess a character that cannot be fully expressed in objective, third-person terms. Even when we have perfect knowledge of all the objective facts about that experience, we find ourselves caught between two seemingly irreconcilable positions: the materialist view that everything, including consciousness and experience, must ultimately be explainable in purely physical terms, and the intuitive sense that something essential about the quality of experience escapes such reduction, that there is something it is like to see color that no amount of neural description can fully capture. This paradox persists in contemporary philosophy and cognitive science, despite decades of sophisticated argument and counterargument, because both positions contain compelling truths that resist easy dismissal, and we have normalized this intellectual tension by acknowledging that consciousness remains one of the deepest unsolved problems in human understanding, a mystery that continues to challenge our most fundamental assumptions about the nature of knowledge, reality, and the relationship between mind and matter in ways that remain as perplexing today as they were when first articulated. Yet perhaps the enduring power of Mary's room lies not in its promise of final resolution, but in its capacity to reveal the contours of consciousness itself, to show us precisely where our explanatory frameworks strain and fail, suggesting that the hard problem of consciousness may ultimately demand not just new theories, but fundamentally new ways of thinking about what knowledge itself can encompass. Perhaps this is why Mary's thought experiment remains so fertile across disciplines. It forces us to confront not merely what we know about consciousness, but the very architecture of knowledge itself, revealing that understanding may require not just accumulating more information, but fundamentally transforming how we relate to X. Consider a neuroscientist examining the biological mechanisms of consciousness, studying how neurons fire and synapses connect, observing all the physical processes that constitute a human brain in its most intricate detail. Yet something remains persistently mysterious to them even after this exhaustive investigation. They can conceive of all the physical facts about consciousness being true, while simultaneously imagining what it would be like to experience the redness of red or the painfulness of pain. And this gap between knowing the physical facts and actually experiencing the subjective sensation seems to suggest that consciousness cannot be fully explained by purely physical processes alone. This is the conceivability argument, which maintains that if we can coherently imagine a scenario where all the physical facts remain the same yet conscious experience differs or disappears entirely, then consciousness itself must be something non-physical, something beyond the material realm. The argument operates on a deceptively simple logical mechanism. If something is conceivable without contradiction, then it must be genuinely possible, and if something is genuinely possible, then our current physical theories cannot be the complete explanation of reality. What makes this argument so psychologically compelling is that consciousness truly does feel different from other physical phenomena, and our subjective experience genuinely seems difficult to reduce to mere neurochemistry, creating a persistent intuition that fills the gap between what we can imagine and what we believe to be true. Yet philosophers have identified numerous problems with this reasoning, observing that conceivability does not necessarily establish possibility, that our inability to imagine something does not prove it is impossible, and that future developments in neuroscience might close the explanatory gap entirely. Despite these logical objections and the increasing sophistication of our understanding of brain function, the conceivability argument continues to hold power over human intuition, perhaps because the subjective character of consciousness remains experientially immediate and personally undeniable in ways that abstract arguments cannot easily challenge or diminish. The zombie argument exemplifies this persistence. The idea that we can imagine philosophical zombies, beings physically identical to humans yet lacking any inner experience, seems to demonstrate a logical gap between physical description and phenomenal consciousness, even though critics argue that such conceivability merely reflects the limits of our imagination rather than the limits of physical explanation itself. The conceivability argument thus reveals a deep tension in human cognition. Our intuitive sense that consciousness escapes physical explanation may say more about the limitations of our imaginative faculties than about the actual nature of reality. Yet this gap persists as one of philosophy's most resistant puzzles precisely because subjective experience remains forever inaccessible to anyone but the experiencing subject themselves. This asymmetry between first-person experience and third-person observation may be fundamental rather than merely epistemic, suggesting that the conceivability argument's enduring appeal derives not from logical fallacy, but from capturing something genuine about the structure of consciousness itself, namely, that subjective experience possesses an irreducible qual. Consider a philosopher standing in a quiet room, contemplating the nature of possibility and necessity, wrestling with a deceptively simple question. If something is possible, must it therefore exist somewhere or somewhen in reality? This is the essence of the modal argument, a logical structure that has captivated minds for centuries, particularly in discussions about God's existence and the fundamental nature of being itself. The argument typically proceeds through a series of steps that seem almost innocent in their progression, beginning with the observation that we can conceive of something as maximally great or perfect, possessing all positive qualities without limitation or flaw. From this initial premise about what we can imagine or conceptualize, the argument then makes a crucial logical leap, suggesting that if something is possible to conceive, then it must be possible in some genuine metaphysical sense. And if it is genuinely possible, then by the very nature of logical possibility, it must exist in at least one possible world or state of affairs. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox operates through our intuitive conflation of imaginability with metaphysical possibility, a confusion that feels almost natural to the human mind because we are accustomed to treating our thoughts as reliable guides to reality. We imagine something vividly and assume that this imagination points toward something that could genuinely exist, rather than recognizing that our cognitive capacity to form concepts extends far beyond the actual boundaries of what is logically or metaphysically possible. The modal argument persists in philosophical discourse despite its questionable logical foundations, because it offers a seductive bridge between the realm of thought and the realm of being, suggesting that pure reason alone, without empirical observation or external evidence, might be sufficient to establish the existence of something ultimate and necessary. This appeal to logical necessity over contingent reality continues to exert intellectual force, even as critics have pointed out repeatedly that the argument smuggles in hidden assumptions about what possibility means, what qualities can coherently coexist, and whether the leap from conceptual possibility to actual existence is truly justified by the rules of formal logic alone. The challenge becomes even more acute when we recognize that the argument's persuasive power often depends less on its formal logical validity than on the emotional resonance of imagining a perfect being. We want the conclusion to be true, and this desire subtly shapes how rigorously we examine the premises themselves. This psychological dimension reveals why modal arguments have proven surprisingly resilient across cultures and centuries. They satisfy a deep human yearning to transcend the limitations of empirical uncertainty, to find in pure thought alone a pathway to ultimate truth, even as the logical scaffolding supporting that pathway remains fundamentally unstable. Yet perhaps this instability itself contains a hidden lesson, that the deepest questions about existence may not yield to pure logical architecture alone, and that the persistent allure of modal arguments reveals less about the structure of reality than about the structure of human hope and our cognitive need to find necessity where only contingency may ultimately exist. Imagine a medieval scholar sitting alone in a monastery, quill in hand, attempting to prove the existence of God through pure thought alone, without appealing to the physical world, without pointing to nature or miracles or sacred texts, but rather by examining the very concept of God itself, and discovering that the idea contains within it a logical necessity that demands actual existence. This is the ontological argument, one of philosophy's most peculiar and fascinating attempts to bridge the gap between thought and reality, between what exists in the mind and what exists in the world. Saint Anselm of Canterbury first formulated this reasoning in the 11th century, proposing that God is defined as that which nothing greater can be conceived, and that if God existed only in the mind and not in reality, then we could conceive of something greater, namely a God that exists both in the mind and in reality, which would contradict our definition of God as the greatest conceivable being. The psychological mechanism underlying this argument operates through a subtle sleight of hand involving our understanding of perfection and existence itself. We define God as the ultimate, the greatest, the most complete, the most perfect being imaginable, and then the argument suggests that existence is itself a perfection, a quality that makes something greater than something else, and therefore if God lacks existence, God would lack a perfection, which would make God not the greatest conceivable being after all. This reasoning creates a strange loop where the definition itself seems to force reality into conformity with thought, where contemplating the concept of absolute perfection somehow necessitates that perfection must exist somewhere beyond mere imagination. Centuries have passed since Anselm proposed this argument, and philosophers have found endless ways to critique it. From Kant's observation that existence is not a real predicate or property that can be added to a concept to modern logicians who question whether we can even coherently define something as the greatest possible being when greatness might be infinite and therefore not comparable. Yet the ontological argument persists in philosophical discourse, continues to fascinate students and scholars, and resurfaces in new forms with each generation, suggesting that there is something genuinely compelling about the idea that thought alone might be sufficient to establish existence, that the structure of reason itself might contain within it the traces of reality. Perhaps this enduring appeal reveals something profound about human cognition itself, that we are beings capable of imagining perfection, and that this capacity to conceive of the infinite and absolute might be the closest we come to touching something that transcends the merely contingent world of change and decay. Whether we ultimately accept or reject the ontological argument's conclusion, engaging with it forces us to confront the mysterious relationship between language, logic, and existence, to ask whether the power of an idea to compel belief in our minds tells us something true about reality, or merely reveals the limits of abstract reasoning when it attempts to leap from the conceptual realm to the actual world. In this sense, the ontological argument stands as a monument to the ancient philosophical dream that reality itself might be fundamentally rational, that the deepest structures of existence align with the deepest structure,